Chapter 1334. Fang Dingshan was worried that the one being surrounded was not Bugnam of Gojoseon. If that was the case, not only would it be a joke, but it would also put the entire army in danger.
Yes.
The scout replied with a firm tone. This general has personally seen Bugnam of Gojoseon. I will definitely not be mistaken. Good. Hearing such a firm reply, Fang Dingshan laughed heartily. He then patted the scout's shoulder with his right hand and said with satisfaction, "You did well. This time, killing Bugnam of Gojoseon will be a great achievement. Now, send out all the scouts. Once you discover any reinforcements from the 5-star army, report to me immediately." After receiving Fang Dingshan's encouragement and praise, the scout left with a face full of excitement. At this time, Fang Dingshan had already made up his mind. He wanted to surround Yang Chendong and kill him. He wanted to kill Bugnam of Gojoseon and achieve a great achievement. When the emperor heard this news, he would definitely be very happy. At that time, it would not be impossible for him to be conferred a duke. Men, this general wants to immediately summon all the generals at home. On Qian Mountain, the Black Cavalry had already cut down many huge trees and placed them together to form a solid defensive wall. It was not like a trench where the trees were placed together to form a house. The large gaps were blocked with huge logs, leaving only a few small gaps for the muzzles to be placed. This way, it would not delay the shooting of the enemy and could also effectively block most of the arrows fired by the enemy. Buckets of clean water were also placed in the wooden huts. There were also prepared dried bacon, 5 meats, ham sausages, instant noodles, and some dry rations. Boxes of shiny yellow bullets were stacked together. There was even a large scale toilet that had just been built not far away. Yang Chendong was clearly prepared for a long battle. What bullshit Ming Liaodong cavalry? What Ming elites? Yang Chendong was going to fight the elites. He wanted to use this battle to let the enemy know the difference between the two sides. From now on, they would be honest and would not cause trouble for him. Therefore, even though the Black Knight Dragon Guard had already seen through the binoculars that many northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry were gathering nearby and were slowly encircling this place, he had no intention of sending a telegram for help. He wanted to first weaken the enemy's morale. For this battle, Yang Chendong took out a lot of light and heavy machine guns and ammunition from the warehouse. He wanted to give the Ming Liaodong Cavalry a head-on blow. If the reinforcements appeared too early, Fang Dingshan would not have to pay such a huge price. Long Wei, get ready. If you feel that you can't hold on, this king will send a telegram to the 1st Cavalry Division, he said in a provocative tone. After these words, some of the Black Cavalry soldiers' faces turned red. The deputy commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, Ba Daojiang, was a straightforward person. He was also deeply trusted by Yang Chendong, so he did not have to worry too much about what he said. Therefore, he was the first to object. 6th young master, please go ahead. We don't need any reinforcements. We can still beat up these Ming Liaodong cavalry until they cry for their parents. With Ba Daojiang taking the lead, the others soon followed and shouted, "Yes, we don't need reinforcements. We are the most powerful." Haha, good. Then this king will sit and watch your performance. This was exactly the result that Yang Chendong wanted. He chuckled and sat on a wooden chair that Beta Persei and the others had just made. He drank the brewed tea, crossed his legs, and leisurely closed his eyes while singing an unknown song. Yang Chendong was very optimistic about this battle, since he was prepared to use firearms against cold weapons. The existence of the Ming Liaodong cavalry was like a thorn in the Yangtze, becoming the biggest threat to Shi City. If he did not remove this thorn, he was afraid that he would be infected at any time and hurt his whole body. Yang Chendong would never allow such a thing to happen. In order to completely solve this problem, he used a lot of firearms this time and even took the initiative to test it out. Even if he had no choice but to take the lives of some Han warriors, he had to do it. Fortunately, according to the intelligence department's understanding, the core component of the Ming Liaodong cavalry was not the Han people, but the Manchu and some Mongolian people. This made him not show any mercy when he attacked. As for whether it was dangerous for him to stand here, Yang Chendong had never thought about it. It was impossible to say that there was no danger at all. Even if there was a war, there would be deaths and injuries. However, It was unrealistic to say that it was very dangerous. After all, he had too many abilities to protect himself. Even if these 2,000 black cavalry could not hold on, he was not afraid. He had plenty of methods to deal with his opponent. Right now, it was just a matter of whether the other party had the ability to force him. At this moment, Yang Chendong, who had his eyes closed, thought of the big warehouse. He thought of the neat rows of war chariots, tanks, and even helicopters inside. This was his true trump card. Just based on this, even if it was a dragon's pool or a tiger's den, he would not be able to enter. With the protection of the big warehouse, Yang Chendong had such confidence. Although he did not know what caused this, with such ability, he had to do something. The world was one, and the Han people were supreme. This became Yang Chendong's goal. Although it seemed that this goal was too grand and difficult to achieve, it was still a dream. However, Yang Chendong firmly believed that as long as he did it step by step, there would be a possibility of success. If he only thought about it every day and did nothing, not to mention that his life was just a short few decades, even if he was given thousands of years, so what? Thinking about this, Yang Chendong slowly fell asleep. There was a peaceful smile on his face, as if he had seen something in his dream that made him happy. Young master, the enemy is about to attack. Seeing Yang Chendong sleeping so soundly, Beta Persei did not want to disturb him. However, after considering that the battle would start soon and the sound of gunfire would not be small, if he did not wake up the young master, it would be a big crime if he really scared him. Oh, is it coming? Slowly opening his eyes, Yang Chendong first rubbed his eyelids, then slowly got up. Finding that the Liaodong cavalry would not attack him, Yang Chendong did not have any doubts about this matter. With such a piece of fat meat in front of him, there was no reason not to eat it. Although it was not appropriate to compare himself to a piece of fat meat, Yang Chendong knew very well that this was the case. After getting up, Yang Chendong took the binoculars from Beta Persei's hands and looked around. Sure enough, Qian Mountain was surrounded by Ming Liaodong cavalry. They were wearing the Great Ming Dynasty's Mandarin Duck military uniform. Each of them held a saber in their hands and led their horses. They looked like they were ready to charge at any time. Quite a lot of them came. There was no trace of fear on his face. On the contrary, Yang Chendong seemed to smile with satisfaction. Then, he strode towards the high platform in the tent that was built by Beta Persei and the others before, so that they could stand higher and see further to observe the enemy. Now, Yang Chendong walked up to the platform. Then, he stood at the highest point of Qian Mountain in his golden battle robe. The appearance of the golden color instantly attracted everyone's attention. Young master, be careful. Seeing Yang Chendong walk to the highest point before the start of the battle, Beta Persei, who was afraid of danger, hurriedly shouted. Qiu Vi, Dao Xiao, Ba Dao Jiang, Peng Yu, and the others behind him were also worried. It's okay. Yang Chendong casually waved his hand, telling Beta Persei and the others not to be excited. Then, he said to Telecommunications Director Wang Shan, "Bring me the loudspeaker." Wang Shan, who had been promoted to director, hurriedly handed over the iron loudspeaker that he had prepared long ago. Although this thing was a little rough, it could still play a certain role in amplifying the sound. He slowly raised the loudspeaker with his right hand and placed it near his mouth. Yang Chendong's voice also spread far and wide. Brothers of the Ming army, I am Yang Chendong, Bugnam of Gojoseon, a king personally conferred by the emperor. But I don't know why you are here. Are you here on the emperor's orders? If not, isn't this no different from a rebellion? If that's the case, you'd better retreat quickly. This king is merciful and can forget all about your appearance here. But if you still don't obey, then don't blame this king for being ruthless. Later, the army will surround you. When that time comes, you won't have a chance to escape. You can decide for yourselves where to go. After shouting loudly, Yang Chendong put away the loudspeaker and returned to the wooden base from the high ground. Seeing that he was safe and sound, Beta Persei first breathed a sigh of relief, but then said with a bitter face, "Young master, I'm afraid it's useless to say this now." Looking at Beta Persei's expression, how could Yang Chendong not know that this person was simply afraid that his words would scare away the Ming Liaodong cavalry? But he didn't point it out and nodded in agreement. Of course it's useless, and I don't expect it to be useful. I said this to tell Fong Dingshan that this king is here, so that he can attack without worry. With this explanation, everyone was suddenly enlightened. Although Yang Chendong had shown himself before, only a few scouts had seen him. Even if it was reported to Fong Dingshan, he would only believe 70% of it. Only after witnessing it with his own eyes would he feel relieved. Otherwise, if the attack didn't go well, and he doubted whether Yang Chendong was really here, what would happen if he retreated? After Yang Chendong's appearance, things were different. After confirming the authenticity of Yang Chendong's appearance, Fong Dingshan would definitely not withdraw his troops unless there was really no hope left for him to make a great contribution. This was the reason why Yang Chendong had to show himself before the battle. This was tantamount to giving Fong Dingshan a reassurance. This king is right here. Come if you have the ability. After knowing Yang Chendong's intentions, Yang Er and the others laughed mischievously. With sufficient preparation, they were most worried that the enemy would run away. If that was the case, then wouldn't they have no place to display their skills? Now, they were even more confident. Each of them laughed heartily and waited for the enemy to charge in and kill them. Chapter 1335. As the Black Cavalry, they were awe-inspiring. However, as the Yang faction continued to grow, they gradually began to feel like heroes had no place to display their talents. Like today, there were not many opportunities to lead the enemy to encircle them. Everyone wanted to perform well, not to mention that they were so well prepared. Look, each person had a Type 95 gun. A squad had 2 light machine guns, a heavy machine gun. A platoon had a 100mm mortar and countless ammunition. With such weapons, how could they face any enemy? Not to mention 100,000. Even if there were 200,000 or 500,000, what could they do? At this time, the 2,000 Black Cavalry were all eager to fight. They had already taken off their black armor and were waiting for the enemy to attack. The war was about to begin. After Beta Persei got Yang Chendong's approval, he began to assign tasks. Considering that there were 3 slopes on Qian Mountain, 1 steep slope, and the area was not very large, Beta Persei divided the Black Cavalry into 2 groups. They were the first and second groups. He requested that when the battle started, the groups would fight one by one, with a limit of 2 hours, and they would take turns to rest. And each group would take out 200 people, a total of 400 people as an emergency team. In case of an accident, there would be soldiers available. Even if they had the best weapons, the number of troops was also very important. Otherwise, if 2,000 people were to shoot randomly, even if they had good weapons, what could they do? In the end, people were still needed in a war. The Black Cavalry of Qian Mountain were making all kinds of preparations. General Fong Dingshan at the foot of the mountain was also flushed. If he had only heard about it before, then he had seen it with his own eyes. The person who shouted was Bugnam of Gojoseon, especially that voice. When he was an imperial bodyguard, he had seen Yang Chendong more than once and heard his voice. Even if it was confirmed that the person who was surrounded was Bugnam of Gojoseon and did not run away, Fong Dingshan firmly believed that his chance to make a great contribution had come. It was only 2,000 cavalrymen. Even if they could fight, how could they be a match for his army of 100,000? Even if it was a battle of attrition, he would exhaust these people to death. Not to mention, the Baiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's reputation as elites was not undeserved. Their combat strength was very strong, and they believed that there was no target that they could not take down. Pass down the order. Let's use 1,000 cavalry as a unit and charge. Other than the steep side, attack the other 3 sides with all your might. Don't be afraid of sacrificing yourself. Try to take down Mount Qiyuan in one go. If you can't do it, attack them one by one. I will exhaust them to death, Fong Dingshan shouted excitedly. He had no intention of underestimating the 2,000 Black Cavalry soldiers. He had also made many preparations so that he could react at any time. Considering the terrain of Mount Qiyuan, sending too many people up would not be of much use. He decided to send 3,000 men to observe the situation first. If there was a chance, the whole army would attack. If it did not work, then he would look for a change. Fong Dingshan was clearly a qualified general. He was not arrogant at all. On the contrary, even when he attacked, he was very careful. When he came up, he would try to probe the enemy. He could be considered an excellent general. With a command, 3,000 Ming Liaodong iron cavalry from 3 directions moved out. Under the beating of the war drums, they spurred their horses forward. 3,000 cavalrymen came from afar in a fan-shaped formation. The cavalrymen were constantly making all kinds of evasive maneuvers. Sometimes they were on top of their horses, sometimes they were below their horses, and sometimes they were close to their horses. Their superb horsemanship was displayed incisively and vividly. They're finally here. On Mount Qiyun, Beta Persei rubbed his hands excitedly. His eyes never left the battlefield for a moment. When he saw that the distance between the two sides was less than 800 meters, he stretched out his hands and placed them on the butt of a heavy machine gun. Soldiers of the 1st Brigade, pay attention. Don't be impulsive. Wait until the enemy is 300 meters away. This time, we won't let them go back. 300 meters was only 10 breaths of time for the charging cavalry. It was dangerous to launch a counterattack at this time. However, after seeing the excellent weapons of the Black Knights and Dragon Guards, everyone felt that it was only right and proper. Moreover, everyone was full of confidence. On the Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's side, Fang Dingshan walked out of the main tent and looked over. He also wanted to see how Yang Chendong was going to get out of the encirclement. Just now, the scout had reported that there were no reinforcements from the 5-star army within 100 miles. In other words, the 2,000 black cavalry were still alone. This made Fang Dingshan overjoyed. With this, he was even more confident that he could kill Bugnam of Gojoseon here. His gaze followed the cavalry's charge. When he saw that they were less than a mile away from the 5-star army's camp, Fang Dingshan was so nervous that his throat almost jumped out of his throat. At this moment, he was full of confidence. He believed that at such a distance, the cavalry was the absolute ruler of the battlefield. The black cavalry had no room to struggle. He was even prepared to order the entire army to charge. Although he only brought 40,000 Ming Liaodong iron cavalry because of time constraints, he was confident that it would not be a problem to take care of 2,000 enemy cavalry. 500 meters, 400 meters, 350 meters, at this distance, those with good eyesight could even see the faces of the Ming Liaodong iron cavalry. They could also see that they were holding onto their bows and ready to shoot at any time. Some of the black cavalry also reflexively began to sweat. Attack! Just when some of the black cavalry were so nervous that they could not help but fire, the temporary commander, Beta Persei, shouted. Then, the heavy machine gun in his hand was the first to fire. Bullets swept forward like beans. The 5 Ming Liaodong iron cavalry in this area were like grass that was crushed by a boulder. They instantly fell to the ground together with their horses. Attack! The captain of the 1st Brigade, Chiu Vi, and the vice-captain, Badeo Jiang, shouted at the same time. Then, the light and light guns and the Type 95 continuous fire and burst fire sounded together. The battlefield was instantly surrounded by all kinds of bullets. One by one, the hot bullet shells kept jumping on the ground. Following that, one by one, the Ming Liaodong iron cavalry fell to the ground. As the ancients said, shoot the horse before shooting the man. But in the eyes of the black cavalry, who had good marksmanship, they preferred to shoot people. It gave them a greater sense of achievement. This also showed the strength of the black cavalry. They had all undergone high-intensity shooting training. Who knew how many bullets they were fed, but their marksmanship was not bad. This time, they finally had a chance to show off. Bullets rained down. One after another, the northern Ming Liaodong iron cavalry fell on the path of the charge. It was a pity that their exquisite horsemanship and impressive martial arts did not even have a chance to display them at this moment. Bullets flew everywhere. In just a quarter of an hour, the 3,000 black cavalry were completely annihilated. Fang Dingshan did not give the order to retreat. Not a single one of the Ming Liaodong iron cavalry retreated. It could be seen that their military discipline was very strict. Hiss! Fang Dingshan in the middle of the army felt a pain in his teeth. These were 3,000 black cavalry. Just like that, they died on the charge. Not a single one of them even had the chance to swing their weapons. This loss made him feel a toothache, a headache, and pain all over his body. General, what do we do? They actually have firearms. Yuji General Mu Qiong also had a pained expression as he asked Fang Dingshan. The Black Cavalry actually had firearms. This was indeed out of Fang Dingshan's expectations. However, it was absolutely impossible for them to retreat just like that. It was not easy to get a chance to surround Yang Qindong. He would not give it up so easily. Facing his subordinate's question, Fang Dingshan pretended to be indifferent and said, "Isn't it just firearms? We Ming Iron Cavalry have them too. We've seen them before. No matter how powerful they are, they still need to use gunpowder. After all, they only have 200 men. I want to see what they will do once they run out of gunpowder. Come, let's order 3,000 more." "No. 6,000 Black Cavalry. Charge." Fang Dingshan did not believe in heresy. After giving this order, he turned to a scout and said, "Immediately send a message to General Luo Baikuan. Tell him to come over here. This time, even if we have to use numbers, we must keep Bugnam of Gojoseon here." Just like that, Yang Qindong's first goal was achieved. That was to rescue the heavy cavalry windchaser unit that was surrounded. With himself as the target, he successfully attracted over 100,000 Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry to rush over. On Qian Mountain, after the first wave of enemies was completely wiped out, there was a burst of cheers from above. Every soldier of the Black Cavalry's 1st Battalion was filled with excitement and excitement. Just now, they had fought to their heart's content. Only now did they know that compared to fighting on horseback, killing with guns was much more satisfying and clean. The 1st Battalion had a good time, while the 2nd Battalion's members were filled with envy and jealousy. The 2nd Battalion's commander, Dao Xiao, purposely approached the temporary commander Beta Persei and said, "Second brother, do you think it's our turn now?" "Oh, it's not time yet, but you can discuss it with Captain Chiu. As long as he agrees, I don't mind." Beta Persei was in a good mood and naturally would not reject Dao Xiao's desire to kill the enemy. He looked at the military watch on his wrist and said casually, Okay. Dao Xiao immediately nodded in agreement and walked to Chiu V's side. Before he spoke, he smiled and said, "Captain Chiu, Brother Chiu, don't say anything. A battalion takes an hour. We've only used less than half of that time. You guys wait a little longer." Chiu V was having a good time. How could he agree to a change of guard so easily? This was such a good opportunity. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it was a once-in-a-decade opportunity. Moreover, even if he agreed, the brothers below him would most likely not agree. Chapter 1336. After being rejected, Dao Xiao's expression turned ugly. When he returned to his own unit, he looked at the expectant faces of his subordinates. He could only pretend to be indifferent and said, "Don't worry, there are still so many enemies here, and there will be more and more. 100,000 people is enough for us to kill to our heart's content." The morale of the members of the 2nd unit was low, but when they heard their leader's words, they were all in high spirits again. That's right, there were so many enemies. Could it be that they would all be wiped out by the 1st unit? Look, the enemy is charging again. This time, there are even more of them. A scout held a pair of binoculars and reported the situation loudly. Haha, good. Hearing this, not only did no one on the mountain show any signs of fear, but instead, the members of the 1st unit were all excited. On the other hand, Dao Xiao and the others were envious. Some of them were even praying in their hearts, "Don't charge so fiercely. Leave some for us to kill." The 6,000 Ming Liaodong cavalry charged forward bravely and fearlessly, as if the death of the 3,000 Ming cavalry did not affect them at all. It had to be said that Fang Dingshan was a person who knew the army well, and he was also a general who was strict in military discipline. Of course, this was also inseparable from the environment of the Great Ming Dynasty. If a martial artist wanted to have a bright future, they could only do so through military merit. Being on the battlefield was the only chance for them to perform. In addition, the Ming Liaodong cavalry was very clear about rewards and punishments, so the 6,000 Ming cavalry charged forward fearlessly. They still don't know the power of our firearms. Come, get ready. When I open fire, don't hold back and kill them all. Beta Persei shouted excitedly. He did not know how long it had been since he had a good battle. He felt all the blood in his body rushing to his head, and he only wanted to continue killing the enemies. Gunshots rang out from the distance of 300 meters, and just like before, the 6,000 Ming Liaodong cavalry fell to the ground amidst the gunshots and cannons. Still, no one could reach the top of Qiyun Mountain. 6,000 people. Although the number was twice as much as before, they were still completely wiped out in less than an hour. After the battle, Beta Persei commanded the 400 Black Cavalry as a reserve force to rush out of the wooden house and onto the battlefield, bringing back some of the ownerless warhorses. During this process, they even discovered more than 100 wounded soldiers of the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. When they saw the Black Cavalry Dragon Guards finally approaching, they seemed to have seen new hope. Unfortunately, in front of the 400 reserve members who were already prepared, they didn't even have the chance to jump up and swing their swords before they were killed by the flying bullets. War horses could be bought. These were all healthy horses, and Bei Ming had spent a lot of money to get them. However, he couldn't take these soldiers. There were only 2,000 Black Cavalry soldiers on the mountain. If there were too many prisoners, it would be hard to avoid unexpected dangers. Yang Chendong was here, so he couldn't be careless about safety. They wouldn't lose the big picture for the small. A total of more than 1,000 high-quality warhorses were captured. At this time, they were all placed in a corner of the mountain. There was already a horse stump there. It was obvious that they were prepared. Another 6,000 Black Cavalry soldiers were completely wiped out. Fang Dingshan's expression became extremely ugly when he saw this. In less than an hour, they had already lost 9,000 Black Cavalry soldiers. Fang Dingshan's heart ached. He had spent a lot of effort to train every single one of these Black Cavalry soldiers. On the battlefield, he felt that it was not worth it even if they were replaced by 2 or 3 5-star army soldiers. But now, 9,000 Black Cavalry soldiers rushed out and didn't even hurt a single hair on the enemy's head. This was very difficult for him to accept. The other generals stood in the big tent at this moment, not knowing what to do. If someone had told them before today that 2,000 enemies would be enough to render them helpless, they would probably have laughed out loud. But when the truth really happened, they realized that nothing was impossible. What was worse was that they didn't know what to do. Retreating was impossible. It wasn't easy to catch Bugnam of Gojoseon, and the scouts would report the surrounding situation every hour. Until now, there were no signs of other 5-star army reinforcements. How could they give up such a rare opportunity? If they couldn't retreat, then they could only charge. But how could they charge to reduce their losses and achieve their goal? Although it was called a siege, there were many ways to do so. For example, the most commonly used method was to surround the enemy without fighting. They would wait for the enemy to run out of food and water. Then, they would surround the enemy and block the enemy. But the problem was that Bugnam of Gojoseon, who was surrounded, wouldn't give them too much time. Who knew how many 5-star army soldiers had already received the news and were rushing here? Just the word wait was enough to make them fall into a disadvantage. Continue to attack. I want to see how much gunpowder they have. Mu Qiong, you take command. Only send out 500 cavalrymen at a time. Spread out and waste the enemy's gunpowder. Fang Dingshan was naturally unwilling to give up such a good opportunity. After thinking for a while, he made this decision. General is wise. After hearing Fang Dingshan's decision, the other generals cupped their fists and looked as if it was only natural. No matter what, a small-scale attack would reduce the risk of their lives. In their hearts, they also wanted to see how much gunpowder this 2,000 5-star army had. Once the enemy ran out of gunpowder, it would be time for them to charge forward and seize victory. Mu Qiong accepted the order and sent out the first 500 cavalrymen. These 500 cavalrymen split into 3 different directions and charged towards the peak of Qiyun Mountain. The formation was very scattered, and this was the best way to distract the enemy's gunpowder. At the peak of the mountain, 2 hours had passed. It was finally the second team's turn to fight. However, what was depressing was that after 15 minutes, the Ming Liaodong cavalrymen still did not make any moves. This made Captain Dao Xiao unable to hold it in any longer and cursed out loud. What's going on? Did they admit defeat? I say, if you have the guts, come at me. I'll be waiting for you here. Perhaps it was because of his cursing, not far away, they could finally see the figures of the Ming Liaodong cavalrymen. However, compared to the previous 2 attacks, there were much fewer of them. With the mindset that a few pieces were still meat, Dao Zhao's second-team soldiers were still in high spirits. Everyone, follow your positions and focus on your targets. Don't waste bullets. Try to hit them with one shot. Dao Xiao was smart. He did not have as many enemies as the first team, so in terms of killing, he could not compare. Since that was the case, then he would compete with his marksmanship. If he could kill an opponent with one shot, then even if there were fewer enemies, he would still be able to shine. 800 muskets against 500 enemies. Before the battle even started, the result was already decided. In just 2 rounds of shooting, many of the soldiers did not even fire a single shot, and the 500 cavalrymen were all sent to meet the King of Hell. Yang Chendong had already arrived at the front of the formation. He had clearly seen what had just happened, and his heart was filled with emotions. If he had not personally been on the battlefield, he would not have thought that victory would be so simple. When the 8-nation alliance first entered Beijing, there were only 10,000 of them. However, they were able to beat up the Qing dynasty's army, which seemed to have a lot of resources, to the point where they could not even tell which way was north. That was because they had been constantly attacking. They were not as well prepared and well equipped as he was. The advantage of firearms against cold weapons was simply too great. On the Beiming Liaodong cavalrymen's side, another 500 cavalrymen died. If one looked closely, they did not even make a splash on the battlefield. Mu Qiong's expression became very ugly. He really wanted to ask General Fang Dingshan to tell him that the battle could not continue like this, but he did not dare to. Before he received any new orders, he could only continue to charge. He only hoped that these people would waste the 5-star army's gunpowder and prepare for the final charge. Just like that, every hour or so, the Beiming Liaodong cavalrymen would charge. The number of people charging varied. Sometimes there were 500 of them, while other times there were only 200 to 300 of them. They were using their lives to fight the Black Cavalry's gunpowder consumption. However, wasn't this giving the Black Cavalry a chance to practice target shooting? This was a real enemy, and such a chance to practice target shooting was rare. Every soldier took the opportunity to ensure that they did not fire. If they did, they would be able to take the enemy's life. The sky quickly darkened, but the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's attack did not stop. They already knew that there were only 2,000 Black Cavalry Dragon Guards in the mountains, so they thought that even if they had to waste time, they would exhaust the enemy's strength. In this regard, Beta Persei asked for instructions from Yang Chendong, and as expected, he took measures to deal with it. A team of 200 people was the norm, and the rest were all to rest. In this way, the problem was easily solved. Not long after, all kinds of snoring and grinding sounds came from the mountains. Compared to the Black Cavalry sleeping soundly, Fang Dingshan was not in the mood to sleep at all. He walked out of the main tent and looked at Qi Yunshan, who was several miles away. His eyes flashed with an indescribable anger. "Just you wait. When my reinforcements arrive tomorrow, we will launch a charge all over the mountains and plains. At that time, I don't believe that you will still have 1,000 hands and feet. Let's see who will be the final victor." Fang Dingshan was already angry. He swore that he would take revenge. For this, he would rather fill in the 100,000 lives here. As long as he could kill Yang Chendong, everything would be worth it. Without a leader, the 5-star army would not be a threat to Beiming. Chapter 1337. At the same time, Yang Chendong, who was on Qian Mountain, had also woken up. When he saw that Wang Shan had also fallen asleep on his bed, he did not disturb him. Instead, he sat in front of the telegraph machine and began to report to the 1st Heavenly Cavalry Division, the new 101st Army, and the divisions directly under them. Looking at the situation on the battlefield today, his safety was naturally not a problem. Even so, what he needed to do now was not for these people to come and help him. Instead, he needed them to set up an inescapable net outside the battlefield. When the Beiming Liaodong cavalry was defeated and retreated, they would surround and eliminate the enemy. Yang Chendong wanted to use this battle to get rid of the malignant tumor of the Beiming Liaodong cavalry. He wanted to use this battle to shut the mouths of the Beiming people and slap their faces. He wanted to make them uncontrollably afraid and fearful when they thought of him. Whether it was waiting or anticipating, the sky finally brightened. Both sides seemed to have formed some kind of tacit agreement. They stopped fighting and started to make breakfast. For a moment, smoke rose in spirals and floated in the sky above and below the mountain. Fang Dingshan quickly finished his breakfast. Mu Qiong walked into the main tent with a blood-red face. He did not sleep last night as he continuously planned all kinds of attacks. Unfortunately, there was almost no effect. He did not even know if this kind of attack affected the sleep of the Black Cavalry. Seeing Mu Qiong walk in, Fang Dingshan sat up straight and asked with a trace of expectation, "How is it?" He already knew that the result would not be good. Otherwise, he would not have sent people to find Mu Qiong. Mu Qiong would have taken the initiative to come. This subordinate is guilty. Mu Qiong did not say anything else and knelt on the ground. Although it was Fang Dingshan who gave the order to continuously attack, Fang Dingshan was a superior. He was the one who carried out the order. If there was a problem, he would have to take responsibility. Fortunately, although Fang Dingshan was greedy for power, he was not an unreasonable person. "All right, stand up and speak." This general gave the order. "No matter what the result is, I will not blame you." "Thank you, General." Mu Qiong's face finally looked better, and he spoke more clearly. "General, after the sky turned dark yesterday, I continuously ordered my men to charge. There were a total of 13 times, and nearly 3,000 cavalrymen were killed. Due to the cover of the night, only 7 of them managed to escape, and 5 of them were injured." Fang Dingshan's face darkened when he heard that they had lost so much in one night. However, he still asked expectantly, "Did anyone manage to get to the top of the mountain? Do you know how much gunpowder they have left?" "No. The defenses on the mountain are tight. We don't have a chance to rush up." Mu Qiong lowered his head and said nervously. Although Fang Dingshan had expected this outcome, he still sighed in disappointment when he heard it. "Is Qian Mountain really so heavily guarded?" "Yes, they have something that can light up everything. Once we charge, this thing will appear and all of our cavalrymen will be exposed. They won't even have time to react before they are shot dead by firearms." Mu Qiong was amazed by the advanced weaponry of the Black Cavalry as he spoke with lingering fear. He would never forget that once the thing that could light up everything appeared, it would be as bright as day on the top of the mountain, and no one would be able to hide from it. "If that's the case, we can't even attack at night." Fang Dingshan was shocked to hear that such an advanced weapon had appeared. He had completely given up on the idea of attacking at night. "Yes, once that thing appears, the cavalrymen will be unprepared and will not be able to adapt to it. Especially the war horses, they will neigh uncontrollably and will not be able to charge at full speed." Mu Qiong wanted to continue exaggerating the power of the weapon, but Fang Dingshan interrupted him. "All right, I got it. Yes, Hin, go and rest." "General, aren't we going to attack later?" Mu Qiong was naturally happy to hear that he could rest, but he was also worried that he would be woken up before he could fall asleep, so he asked, "Wait, General Luo will be here soon. Once he arrives, we will launch a big attack. No matter what, this time we must take down Qian Mountain and take Bugnam of Gojoseon's head." Fang Dingshan was almost furious as he spoke. If one listened carefully, one could hear the sound of teeth gnashing. The battlefield suddenly quieted down. This made Xiu Vi and Dao Xiaoan happy. After resting for a night, they thought that the battle would continue and they would be able to kill to their heart's content. However, Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry was terrified. This was really disappointing. "Don't worry, it's just the darkness before dawn. Perhaps the big attack will begin soon." Yang Qindong's face was calm, but his words were full of murderous intent. He didn't believe that Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry would give up the chance to kill him. They weren't attacking now, but they were just waiting. The more they acted like this, the more it meant that the scale of the next attack would be huge. In the eyes of the Black Cavalry, Yang Qindong was like a god. Since he said so, no one doubted him. Knowing that a big battle was imminent, all the soldiers began to clean their guns and reload, preparing for the battle that could erupt at any time. Soon, it was noon. Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry still didn't move, but there were rumbling sounds of horses galloping on the ground not far away. As dust rose into the air, Deputy General Luo Baikuan finally brought the rest of the Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry over. A total of 85,000 Ming's Liaodong cavalry gathered together. Looking down from the mountain, it was a black mass. It was a spectacular sight. Are they finally here? Yang Chendong took the binoculars and looked down the mountain. After seeing everything clearly, a cold smile appeared on his face. He had a feeling that the enemy's charge would begin soon. At this moment, he couldn't help but sigh at how difficult Fang Dingshan was to deal with. Imagine, if they attacked in the afternoon, there was no need to talk about using it. But if they failed, they could use the night to retreat. That way, even if there was an ambush outside, it would be extremely difficult to catch them all. Before planning for victory, one had to think about defeat. This was a quality that a good general had to have. Come on, adjust the muzzles. Once the enemy attacks, immediately launch a blanket attack on the enemy camp. This time, we need to kill as many of the enemy's forces as possible, so that they won't be able to pose any threat for a while. Yang Chendong said as if he was preparing for a rainy day. If the enemy wanted to do something ruthless, why wouldn't he do the same? At that moment, the 3,100mm mortars on the mountain were fully prepared. Other than that, a few flamethrowers and grenades were also taken out. The light and heavy machine guns were loaded with ammunition to ensure that once they opened fire, they would be able to continuously kill the enemy. Send a telegram to the 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Division of the new army, and the subordinate division to prepare to face the scattered enemy. Yang Chendong didn't forget about the cavalry army outside. This was enough to prove his confidence in the black cavalry. At the foot of the mountain, Luo Baikuan walked into the main tent in full armor and came in front of Fang Dingshan. Once he entered the tent, Luo Baikuan said anxiously, "General, is Bugnam of Gojoseon sure that he's on the mountain?" "Yes." Fang Dingshan nodded and answered with a very confident tone. Hearing this answer, Luo Baikuan smiled. He gave up the opportunity to completely annihilate the heavy cavalry regiment to come here. If Bugnam of Gojoseon wasn't on the mountain and there were only 2,000 black cavalry soldiers, he wouldn't be interested. But now, it was different. If he could kill Yang Chendong, it would definitely be a great achievement. No matter how many heavy cavalry regiments he annihilated, it would still be incomparable. "General, when are we going to attack?" Luo Baikuan didn't know the power of the firearms in the black cavalry soldiers' hands. At this moment, he was a little anxious. Perhaps he didn't even put the black cavalry in his eyes. After all, there were only 2,000 people. No matter how powerful they were, it was only 2,000 people. Against almost 100,000 elite Ming Liaodong heavy cavalry, what could they do? Seeing Luo Baikuan's confidence, Fang Dingshan wanted to come to the same conclusion. But when he thought of the big loss he suffered yesterday, he had to be realistic. They have firearms. Don't underestimate them. Firearms? When Luo Baikuan heard this, he still said disapprovingly, "I've seen firearms before. Just like the 20,000 firearms camp that Gao Yu brought, it's just SOSO. We can take it down with one charge. There are only 2,000 enemies here. What can they do? We have the advantage in numbers. Victory is not a problem at all." Luo Baikuan's confident words were heard by Fang Dingshan, and he was very encouraged. "Yes, we have the advantage in numbers. Even if the enemy's firearms are powerful, they can't kill us all. As long as we can rush to the top of the mountain, victory will be ours." Fang Dingshan, who had received encouragement, was grinning from ear to ear. Then, he called in the generals to make arrangements for the battle. At this moment, he seemed to be able to see the scene of Yang Chendong's head being chopped off and presented to the Daizong Emperor. Looking down from the bottom of the mountain, he could see the Ming Liaodong heavy cavalry gathering their troops. Seeing more and more enemies getting on their horses, Yang Chendong put down his binoculars after he pulled out his sabers. "Prepare to load the ammunition. Fire the cannons." Ming Liaodong heavy cavalry was ready to charge. Yang Chendong couldn't just let them do as they pleased. After all, the difference in numbers was too great. If he really waited for the enemy to charge in front of him before he opened fire, with the cavalry's speed, the enemy would reach him in 300 meters. If that was the case, he would be in danger. He couldn't just sit there and wait for death. He had to strike first. He believed that since the enemy decided to charge, they wouldn't stop just because he made the first move. Chapter 1338. Once the order was given, the 30 mortars that had been prepared and calibrated were immediately loaded with ammunition. When Yang Chendong saw the 30 soldiers holding 30 cannonballs looking at him, he didn't hesitate and said, "Load and fire, fire." With a loud shout, the 30 cannonballs were quickly swallowed by the cannon barrel. Then, there was a loud rumbling sound. The cannonballs drew a beautiful arc in the sky and fell towards the camp of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry. At this moment, the Beiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry were still preparing. There were simply too many people. There had to be an arrangement as to who would attack first and who would follow suit. Otherwise, if they all rushed forward, there would be no space for them to display their skills. They might even end up crowding each other. Suddenly, there was a whistling sound in the sky. The Beiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry, who were still preparing, instinctively looked up. However, the speed of the cannonballs was too fast for them to catch sight of. When they raised their heads, they saw bursts of flames appearing beside them, followed by thunderous booms. Boom, 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 boom. When the cannonballs landed, they landed right in the middle of the dense crowd. For a moment, a powerful shockwave blew over like a gale. The northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry were thrown off their horses like kites with their strings cut. Some of the war horses were also frightened and began to flee in all directions while neighing incessantly. The war horse, which had always been docile, no longer recognized its owner. In its shock, it ran around randomly, crashing into all directions. Who knew how many of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry were knocked to the ground and trampled by the horse's hooves? The cannonballs sounded and tents were overturned. Some even caused a sea of fire, giving people a feeling of purgatory. Don't panic, don't panic. Follow me and charge. Charge. Luo Baikuan saw the cannonballs falling and messing up the formation of the army. He was naturally furious. While he was shocked by the power of the Black Cavalry's cannonballs, he made a bold decision to charge immediately. Otherwise, who knew how messy the army would be if this continued, and whether they would have the ability to counterattack. The roar of the cannonballs and explosions disrupted the Beiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's formation, making them unable to gather on time and launch a large-scale charge. It also forced the enemy to attack as soon as possible. Calling it a decisive battle was a bit of an exaggeration. One side had 80,000 elite cavalry, while the other side only had 2,000 black cavalry. The difference in numbers was too great. Calling it a decisive battle was a bit wrong because this was a one-sided massacre. It had nothing to do with a decisive battle. Calling it a decisive battle was inappropriate. There had never been a decisive battle where one side had lost soldiers and generals while the other side had no losses. Rather than calling it a decisive battle, it was more appropriate to call it a suicidal battle. The roar of the cannonballs continued. One cannonball after another landed in the camp of the Beiming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. Whether it was those who were about to charge, those who were preparing to charge, or those who were left behind, none of them were spared. This was because no one knew where the next cannonball would land and who it would kill. The sound of gunfire continued like the firecrackers set off by the rich during the New Year. There was no sign of it stopping. As the bullets were fired, the war horses that were charging forward were hit one after another. The cavalrymen on the war horses were hit one after another. They had no choice but to fall to the side with their horses. The sound of explosions continued. When the enemy was about 100 meters away from them, rocket launchers fired one after another, landing in the crowd, causing waves of explosions and screams of agony. If the enemy was a bit closer, the grenades would fall from the sky like raindrops falling from the sky. At the same time, they would create a huge blaze, and at the same time, they would also kill and injure the northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. The 2,000 black cavalry on Chiyun Mountain divided up the work in an orderly manner. Some were firing cannonballs, some were shooting, and some were throwing grenades. They were all busy at this moment. Almost all of the 2,000 people were using it. No one stopped to rest. Everyone was very busy. Although it was very tiring, it was worth it. It was because this kind of battle was not something that could be encountered all the time. Fortunately, the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry had strict discipline and a clear goal. They wanted to kill Yang Chendong wholeheartedly. If it was another opponent, they would have been scared away. Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's losses continued to increase. More than half of 1,000 people would be lost before they reached the halfway point of the mountain. When they were only a few dozen meters away, not a single one would be left. The highest peak of Chiun Mountain seemed to have become a natural moat. A huge gap completely separated the two sides. Even if you had the power to split the sky, you would still not be able to take a step forward. Charge. Continue to charge. Don't be afraid of death. They only have 2,000 cavalry. Luo Baikuan had already stopped his warhorse. He brought some of his soldiers to hide behind a few big trees. They used the branches to hide themselves. The losses were so great that Luo Baikuan's heart was bleeding at every moment. However, he could no longer shout for them to stop. After fighting for so long, if they stopped, then all of their previous efforts would be wasted. He wanted to see how much gunpowder the enemy had. He did not believe that his 80,000 cavalry would not be able to exhaust the enemy's gunpowder. As long as the enemy's firearms could not be used, he believed that the Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry's spit could take Bugnam of Gojoseon's life. The Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry continued to charge. Although many people saw the power of the firearms, they could only continue to charge since their superiors did not give the order to retreat or stop attacking. This was especially true when some of their fellow soldiers had died right beside them, which made them feel deeply stimulated. At this moment, they were like mad bulls. They only knew to keep moving forward. They only had one goal, which was to rush to the top of the mountain and kill the Black Knight Dragon Guards. The charge was still going on. At a certain camp at the foot of the mountain, Fong Dingshan was already vomiting blood from the heartache. The Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry was an elite cavalry unit that he had painstakingly built. In an environment where Ming lacked warhorses, it was easy to imagine how difficult it was to form a cavalry unit with 100,000 people. For this reason, the Daizong Emperor did not hesitate to take out money from the state treasury from various ministers and the Northern Ming Bank to make up for the shortfall, giving him sufficient support in the hopes that he would be able to raise the army and restore the glory of the Northern Ming army. In this army that even the emperor had invested a lot of money into, Fong Dingshan had put in a lot of effort. He did not fear the dangers of the journey and came to Liaodong. With his silver tongue and large amounts of money, he persuaded many strong young men to join the army. He also went to the prison and saved some Mongolian prisoners and sent them to the army. He also found many merchants who often went to the grasslands and used a high price to buy Mongolian men who were skilled in horse riding. He also walked through many Ming army units and picked out many strong soldiers to fill the Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. It could be said that the internal structure of the Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry was very complicated. It took a lot of effort for each person to join. Fortunately, the results were satisfactory. Even the famous heavy cavalry unit of the 5-star army was no match for them. This gave Fong Dingshan hope and a future. This was also the reason why he dared to bring the army here even though he knew that Yang Chendong had appeared and was already prepared. He firmly believed that no matter how strong the opponent was, he still had a great advantage against nearly 100,000 cavalry with only 2,000 men. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. At this time, Fong Dingshan was trapped in this argument, seeing elite cavalrymen charging out one after another, only to quickly fall on the path of the charge. Their sabers were not stained with blood, and their strength had not been fully displayed. They were already dead. That kind of feeling made his heart ache and palpitate. What kind of brain did Bugnam of Gojoseon have to create so many powerful firearms? Just what kind of person was Wu Nan Wang to be able to create such a battle formation with the few against the many? What kind of courage did Bugnam of Gojoseon have to face 100,000 with 2,000 men and not be afraid? Instead, he was filled with killing intent. At this moment, Fong Dingshan hated Yang Chendong to the core. If cursing could kill someone, then even 1,000 lives would not be enough for Bugnam of Gojoseon. His eyes were red, his heart was bleeding, and blood was flowing out of the corner of his mouth because of the heartache. Gradually, Fong Dingshan, who was always calm and composed and never moved in the slightest, became more and more unsightly. His mental endurance had reached its limit, and he was about to collapse. "General, should we retreat?" Mu Qiong was standing guard beside Fong Dingshan. He watched as countless cavalrymen charged forward, but soon there was no news of them. The lively young lad had turned into a corpse that could not move at all. How could his heart not bleed? Before he knew how much gunpowder Bugnam of Gojosian had prepared, he thought that such a reckless charge would not solve anything, so he thought of persuading them to stop. Fong Dingshan's face showed a hint of hesitation and struggle, but he quickly shook his head. No, we can't stop. Indeed, they could not stop. If this could not take down Yang Chendong, Fong Dingshan did not know when he would have the chance to kill this person. As long as Yang Chendong did not die, Bai Ming would be in danger, and it was not impossible for the country to be destroyed. Therefore, no matter how high the price he had to pay, Fong Dingshan could not retreat, and he could not hesitate. He wanted to pay with lives today. He wanted to see how long the five-star army could last. Did they not know how tiring it was to kill people? Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry did not show any signs of stopping, and the gunshots on Qian Mountain did not stop either. However, if one listened carefully, the gunshots were not as intense as before. Chapter 1339. On the top of the mountain, the heavy machine guns had already become scalding hot due to overheating. Some light machine guns also had the same problem. Fortunately, there was enough water on the mountain. At this moment, buckets of water were poured under the guns, igniting a large amount of steam. Stop the light and light machine guns appropriately and use them after cooling down. All the people who have retreated, go get grenades and blow up these enemies. Yang Chendong's voice replaced Beta Persei's. In a war that had never been organized with such intensity, Beta Persei's commanding ability obviously still needed to be improved. Fortunately, Yang Chendong in his previous life had seen all kinds of storms and waves, so he quickly replaced the commanding position. Under his command, the 2,000 black cavalry did their own things in an orderly manner and dealt a heavy blow to the enemy. Beta Persei was still learning seriously from the side. However, he didn't know if there would be another chance to command like this. After all, not every enemy was as brave, fearless, and disciplined as Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry. Countless grenades were thrown down the mountain. After a series of explosions and smoke, another batch of Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry fell on the charging road. Yang Chendong took this opportunity to wipe the sweat on his forehead. At this moment, he had to admit that Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry's bravery was beyond his expectations. If it wasn't for his ample preparation, he was afraid that the enemy might have really rushed up. If that was the case, with only the 2,000 black cavalry, he could only rely on Song to rush out. That was his trump card, and he wouldn't use it easily. Otherwise, some things wouldn't be easy to explain. The bravery of Bai Ming's Liaodong cavalry was beyond Yang Chendong's expectations, but how could it not be a happy thing? The fiercer the other party charged now, the greater the losses would be, and the less of a threat they might pose to him in the future. It was even possible to wipe them all out here. That way, the threat of Bai Ming would be greatly reduced, and the entire five-star army would be able to spare more energy and manpower to do what they wanted to do. The sound of gunfire was still going on. 4 hours later, the sky outside was completely dark. The only thing that could be seen on the battlefield was the muzzle flashes that constantly spewed out bullets, as well as the flares that were fired into the air from time to time. Every time the flare lit up, gunshots would ring out. Groups of northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry would fall down like sand blown by the wind. This scene was clearly seen by everyone under the illumination of the flares. As more and more of the Bai Ming Liaodong cavalry became corpses, the morale of the army began to waver. No one in the world was willing to die. As long as there was a bit of hope to live, they wouldn't take the initiative to seek death. The previous attack was completely due to the strict discipline of the Bai Ming Liaodong cavalry, and the fact that the target was only 2,000 people, which gave countless people hope. But now, seeing that the five-star army's gunfire didn't seem to stop, and even the heavy and light machine guns that had stopped firing were starting to ring out again, some of the soldiers who thought that the five-star army didn't have enough gunpowder finally began to feel disappointed. There was no chance of victory at all, and they were only using human lives to fill the gap. When would this kind of battle end? If the 80,000 cavalry were all here, but the other party still had gunpowder, what would they do? Wouldn't that mean that everyone had died here for nothing? Everyone had their own selfish motives, especially on a battlefield where there was no chance of victory. Some people couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. The first to make a move were the Mongolian grassland men that Fong Dingshan had spent a lot of money to invite from the merchants. They were like mercenaries, and they came here for money. As long as someone paid them, they would give their lives. Even if they died in battle, they wouldn't regret it. But even if they knew that they would die, they still wanted to charge. That wasn't something a greedy person would do. Even if they had money, they had to be alive to spend it. When they saw that the 5-star army was still full of firepower, these people were shaken. Then, some self-proclaimed smart people began to flee under the cover of the night when no one was watching them. When the first person retreated, the people around him quickly followed suit. Soon, more and more cavalrymen began to disregard the military order and retreat. Their retreat was like a domino effect, causing more and more cavalrymen to retreat. Humans were social animals. What they would do the most was follow suit. When they saw that the people around them had begun to retreat, it was their nature to retreat as well. As for the so-called consequences, that was a matter for the future. As a result, on the battlefield, in the dark, more and more Ming Liaodong cavalry started to retreat. It was like a plague that spread to everyone. Many cavalry who didn't know what was going on thought that it was an order from the general and also retreated. Luo Baikuan, who was hiding under the cover of the trees, quickly realized that something was wrong. He knew that the thing he was most worried about had happened. In order to obtain the final victory, there was no time for him to think. He rushed out from his hiding place and shouted, "Everyone, listen to my order. Continue to charge. Charge. Those who retreat will die." After shouting this, Luo Baikuan rode his warhorse into the battlefield and slashed at the head of a Mongolian soldier who was retreating. Swoosh! With one slash, a head rolled to the ground. At this time, Luo Baikuan was like a killing god. He ignored the blood splattered on his body as he shouted loudly, "This general is here. Those who retreat will be killed." Luo Baikuan used his actions to show everyone what battlefield discipline was. This action also frightened many of the surrounding cavalrymen. The soldiers who originally wanted to retreat had no choice but to stop what they were doing. Phew! Seeing that the army had temporarily stabilized, Luo Baikuan let out a sigh of relief. In order to increase the victory, he shouted, "They only have 2,000 people. They can't have so much gunpowder. As long as we persevere, victory will be ours." He was still cheering his subordinates on, encouraging them to continue to charge. It could also be said that he was encouraging them to die. Suddenly, a flare lit up in the sky and lit up the mountainside like it was daytime. With the help of the flare, the black cavalry at the top of the mountain saw everything. When they saw a small number of Ming Liaodong cavalrymen, Ba Daojiang, who was in charge of artillery support, laughed. "Come on, charge to the mountainside and open fire." When the flare lit up, Luo Baikuan, who was riding on his horse, had a bad feeling. However, he didn't retreat immediately because he knew that many soldiers were looking at him. If he were to hide like this, the morale of the army would definitely be greatly affected. He was afraid that the army would really be routed. With a fluke mentality, Luo Baikuan continued to shout to the soldiers gathered around him, "There is no one in this world that can't be killed. We have a strong advantage in numbers. As long as everyone works together, victory will definitely belong to us. As long as we can kill Bugnam of Gojoseon, we will all be heroes. The great Ming dynasty will remember us, and we will be conferred the title of Marquis." Chirp, boom. Just as Luo Baikuan was encouraging the morale of the army, suddenly, dozens of cannonballs fell from the sky and covered their area. Coincidentally, one of the cannonballs landed 3 meters away from Luo Baikuan. Following a loud bang, an indescribable wave of air enveloped Luo Baikuan. Luo Baikuan, who was still thinking of saying something on his warhorse, felt his chest tighten. Then, he was separated from his warhorse and flew into the air. Luo Baikuan, who was flying in the air, still had his mouth open. However, because his internal organs were severely injured, he could no longer utter a single word. As he opened and closed his mouth, streams of dark red blood flowed out. Luo Baikuan was actually blown away. One could imagine that the Ming Liaodong cavalrymen, who had recovered some of their morale, could not take it anymore. Their general was dead, so why were they still guarding here? Even if they were to charge, who would they charge for? Run. No one knew who shouted so loudly, but the Beiming Liaodong cavalrymen began to collapse. This move quickly became a trend that no one could stop. Fang Dingshan, who was waiting for the news of victory, suddenly saw countless black figures retreating from the foot of the mountain. His eyes could not help but widen. He knew that the result he was most afraid of had happened. Before this, Fang Dingshan had already made up his mind. As long as the soldiers did not retreat, he would not retreat. Even if he had to sacrifice all of the Beiming Liaodong cavalrymen, as long as he could kill Yang Qindong, everything would be worth it. But now, the army suddenly retreated. He did not give such a military order, so there was only one result. The army's morale and momentum were gone. This was the only result. It's over, it's over. Tears fell from the corner of Fang Dingshan's eyes. He knew that the situation was over. At this time, even if he stood out and wanted to boost the army's morale, it was obviously impossible. Dispersing was dispersing. It was not something that anyone could gather in a short period of time. Fang Dingshan, who said that it was over, did not manage to catch his breath and immediately fainted. If Mu Qiong hadn't reacted quickly enough and caught him, he would have been seriously injured from the fall. Mu Qiong did not understand why the general suddenly fainted. Just as he was panicking, a fast horse came in front of him, reporting, "General Luo Baikuan has died in battle. The army has begun to retreat." Chapter 1340. What? This bad news finally made Mu Qiong understand what had happened. He sighed at how fast the general's reaction was, and his expression changed. The army had retreated. Didn't that mean that they had lost the battle? Since they had lost, they had to fight the way they lost. Thinking of this, he immediately said, "Even so, we can't just sit here and wait for death. All troops retreat and find a safe place to wait for the general to wake up. Retreat." Without Fang Dingshan and Luo Baikuan, Mu Qiong's orders were naturally the most important. Under the command of this general who had long wanted to retreat, the army could finally retreat openly. The Beiming Liaodong cavalry who had received the military order and were prepared to risk their lives to charge finally heaved a sigh of relief. Then, none of them charged up the mountain. They turned around and fled in all directions without any pattern. On the peak of Qian Mountain, the exhausted black cavalry was still waiting for the Beiming Liaodong cavalry to charge. But all of a sudden, the battlefield quieted down, which made everyone feel that it was unreal. For the past few hours, the enemy's warhorses had been charging. Shouts and screams shook the sky. Under the sound of guns and cannons, many people's ears were buzzing. They were not used to the sudden silence. However, when Yang Qindong heard that there was no sound of horses charging, his whole body shook. After taking a look through the binoculars, he became even more determined. He said, "The Beiming Liaodong cavalry can't win and want to escape. Ha! Men, fire the cannons. Even if they want to escape, we have to skin them alive." Boom, 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 boom. Under Yang Qindong's order, the cannons rumbled. Who knew how many of the Beiming Liaodong cavalry who were fleeing were hit by the cannons and died tragically on the ground? Soon, there was a roar of excitement on Qian Mountain. "We won! We won!" Yang Er shouted. At the same time, he jumped up and down non-stop. The other commanders and soldiers were also cheering loudly, celebrating the moment of victory. Even if they had the most advanced firearms in their hands, no one could guarantee that they would win against nearly 100,000 cavalry with only 2,000 soldiers. Only they themselves would know if there were people who were worried or on edge during the process. And now, they had finally obtained the final victory. At this moment, everyone was extremely excited. At the same time, they looked at Yang Qindong with admiration. This was their king. He fought against 100,000 with 2,000 soldiers and forced the enemy to retreat. Although there were many people in history who won against the enemy, only their king could achieve such a glorious result. They were proud to be part of their king's side. How many people did we kill? Among the cheers, it was unknown who had suddenly said such a sentence, but it instantly attracted everyone's attention. 30,000? I think it's more than that. Our first platoon killed nearly 20,000 people. Xiao V shook his head. Obviously, he was dissatisfied with the number of soldiers. That's right. I think there were at least 40,000 people. Our second platoon also killed nearly 20,000 people. Dao Xiao also jumped out. Although he did not have to worry about the military merit because he was with Yang Chendong, he still had to fight for it. Are you kidding me? Did our artillery team not do anything? We killed at least 10,000 people. Ba Daojiang also stood out. He would never allow anyone to take away his achievement, not even the two platoon leaders. For a moment, there was a heated discussion about how many people they had killed. Yang Chendong did not participate. Because of the firearms and the dark sky, he did not know how many people they had killed. However, he believed that he would get the results soon. Because outside of Qian Mountain, the 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Division of the new 1st Army, and the 1st Cavalry Division of the new 2nd Army were all in place. As long as they stopped the Baiming Liaodong Cavalry, they would be able to get a rough idea of how many people they had lost. Yes, the 1st Cavalry Division of the new 2nd Army had also arrived outside of Qian Mountain. They were led by the commander of the Mercenary Division. His original mission was to guard Tulu City with 2 divisions to prevent the 50,000 Baiming army inside the city from converging with the 80,000 Baiming army outside the city. However, as the commander of the Mercenary Division that Yang Chendong had entrusted with such an important task, he was not a passive person. When he arrived on the battlefield, he quickly displayed his skills. He sent people to disguise themselves as the Baiming army to open the city gates and force their way into Tulu City. The sudden arrival of the 2 divisions of cavalry caused the 50,000 Baiming army to panic. Most of them were new soldiers who had never been on the battlefield. Although they had undergone some training, they had never seen real combat. They had never even seen blood. How could they be a match for the elite new 2nd Army cavalry? In just a little more than 4 hours, Tulu City had become the territory of the new 2nd Army. She had once come from this place, so she was naturally very familiar with every blade of grass and tree here. Soon, she issued a series of correct orders. Not only did she take complete control of Tulu City, she also seized a large amount of food and 45,000 captives. After the great victory in Tulu City, Mercenary Division received news that Yang Chendong had used himself as bait to lure the Baiming Liaodong cavalry into Qian Mountain. He immediately handed over the task of defending the city to the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, Li Jun. Then, he brought the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, Xiao Chao, and hurried towards Qian Mountain. When Yang Chendong received the news that another division had joined, he was naturally overjoyed. This gave him even more confidence in surrounding the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. If it wasn't for the fact that the Black Cavalry had just gone through an intense battle and were all exhausted, he probably would have joined in the pursuit of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. Everyone has contributed and is tired. Leave behind 200 people to guard the city at night. Everyone else, take the time to rest. We'll clean up the battlefield when the sun rises. Yang Chendong laughed and said to everyone. After seeing everyone's excited smile, he didn't rest. Instead, he went to the simple sand table and looked at the surrounding situation. In this battle, he had already crippled the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. However, even if he didn't wipe them out, it was still an extremely important task. Otherwise, once the enemy was given enough time, it wouldn't take long for them to rise from the ashes. This wasn't the result Yang Chendong wanted to see. Looking at the sand table, Yang Chendong was thinking about where the Baiming Liaodong cavalry might escape. At the same time, a voice kept ringing in his mind. Tiger's Mane, Shibei, and Luzhua will definitely be able to do it. They will definitely be able to deal a heavy blow to the Baiming Liaodong cavalry and eliminate this stubborn enemy. The northern Ming's Liaodong Iron Cavalry had suffered a crushing defeat on Mount Qiyun. After charging up the mountain and suffering heavy injuries, it could be said that their morale had plummeted. They no longer had their previous invincible momentum. At this moment, they were fleeing everywhere like stray dogs. Some were in groups of 1,000, some were in groups of 100, and some were in groups of 12 or even a few people. The defeated soldiers were like this. There was no formation at all. They just dragged their battered bodies and ran without knowing where to go. Some people even lost their war horses. However, they still kept running in order to escape from Qian Mountain. In their hearts, this was the gate to hell. No matter who stayed here, they would only die. The defeat of the Biming Liaodong cavalry gave the five-star army a great opportunity. The divisions of the various armies formed a huge encirclement with the company as a unit. Whenever they saw a defeated enemy, they would wait for an opportunity to attack. If there were a few more enemies, they would immediately send out a signal to ask for help from the other companies. In short, it was to seal off this area so that not a single bird could fly out. Yang Qindong's orders were exactly like this. Although he did not know how much damage the Biming Liaodong cavalry had suffered in this battle, he believed that the enemy's discipline was loose and their morale was low. The five-star army, who had always worshipped Yang Qindong's words, naturally acted according to the order, and the encirclement by the company was launched. The orders were given without any hesitation. However, not everyone had their own thoughts. For example, the heavy cavalry regiment commander Zhu Feng, who was hiding in a valley with a company, was currently waiting for a battle. His heart was beating like a drum. He was very clear about the strength of the Biming Liaodong cavalry. Even his heavy cavalry regiment was not a match for them. He also heard that the 6th young master only had 2,000 black cavalry. Could they really face 100,000 Biming Liaodong cavalry and not be defeated? If this was said by someone else, Zhu Feng would naturally not believe it. He would even accuse the other party of false military intelligence and punish them. However, this came from the 6th young master, so he did not dare to say anything. All this time, no one knew how many miracles Yang Qindong had created. It was to the point that everyone was used to him doing some shocking things and would not suspect anything. Zhu Feng was still thinking about the reliability of this matter. If it was true, how did the 6th young master do it? While this question was still flashing in his mind, the company commander suddenly said, "Commander Zhu Feng, there is a situation." Oh? Zhu Feng immediately put away his chaotic thoughts. He held the binoculars in his hand and looked up. He saw no less than 700 cavalry wearing the northern Ming military uniform rushing towards them in a panic. Among these 700 people, only half of them had war horses. There were also some that only borrowed the power of their legs and held their ponytails. It seemed that this was the only way they would not fall behind. Only then would they be able to live and die with the main force. There are more than 700 people. Commander Zhu Feng, let's send the signal for reinforcements. This company commander only led 100 people. Seeing that the enemy was 7 times their number, he could not help but feel nervous. This was the Biming Liaodong cavalry. It was rumored that they were very powerful. Even the heavy cavalry regiment had suffered a loss in their hands. Chapter 1341. Zhu Feng naturally saw the enemy's numbers, but he wasn't as flustered as the company commander beside him. Instead, he carefully looked through his binoculars and shook his head. Look, although the enemy has a lot of people, they are clearly defeated soldiers. The army has no formation and has no morale. So what if there are more of them? Although we only have 100 people, we can wait patiently. The morale of the army is not something the enemy can match. What is there to fear? Hearing Zhu Feng's bold words, the company commander understood why he could become a regiment commander. Moreover, he was the regiment commander of the heavy cavalry regiment. He wasn't any worse than a normal division commander. It turned out that she was this daring and daring. Just this point alone was something that the current him could not compare to. Admiring Zhu Feng's courage, the company commander was also encouraged. Regiment Commander Zhu, you mean to say that we don't need to ask for help and can eat them with our own strength? That's right, this is a great merit. Could it be that everyone doesn't want to contribute? Zhu Feng was clear that these weren't soldiers of the heavy cavalry regiment. If he wanted to use his status as a regiment commander to suppress them, it wouldn't be too effective. Thus, he could only use benefits to entice them. The military merits of the 5-star army were not bad rewards. This was the magic weapon to defeat the enemy. When it came to contributions, the eyes of the 100 soldiers couldn't help but shine. Then, there was the sound of rapid breathing. After a few breaths, the company commander had already made a decision and said, Regiment Commander Zhu, we will listen to you. We will do whatever you say. Zhu Feng was waiting for this sentence. He immediately replied with a good and then ordered, everyone, don't be anxious. After all, we are still at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. In a moment, we will divide into 10 groups and surround them. When the enemy is within 100 steps, we will suddenly use bows and arrows to attack from afar. Then, the 1st to 7th groups will charge out. The 8th to 10th groups will stay in place and continuously appear. This will give the enemy the feeling that we have a lot of troops and trick them. Do you understand? As if he felt that he had not said enough, Wind-Chasing Wolf added, "Of course, you don't have to be afraid. If the enemy's momentum is too strong, we can retreat. Then we can send a signal and surround them with the other company commanders." Whether it was advancing or retreating, all of them had already been chosen. The warriors were no longer flustered, and they began to prepare according to the tactics that Windchaser had arranged. After the 100-man team was dispersed, it gave people the impression that their military strength had doubled, and there were hundreds of them. Just as the soldiers of each company reached their designated positions, the defeated Ming Liaodong cavalry arrived within 100 steps of them. Windchaser took the lead and shot out an arrow. A Ming Liaodong cavalry soldier at the front fell off his horse. Following that, another wave of arrows shot out and dozens of enemy soldiers were ambushed. This sudden attack caused the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong Iron Cavalry, who were already trembling with fear, to become even more chaotic. It was at this moment that Zhuge Feng led 7 squads of warriors and charged out from the shadows, loudly shouting that those who surrendered would not be killed. Behind them, there was a cloud of dust. Those were the 30 warriors who were left behind, constantly running back and forth, creating a commotion to strengthen their momentum. The sudden appearance of the 5-star army was like a heavenly army descending from the heavens. It gave the Ming Liaodong cavalry a heavy psychological blow. They were already like arrows at the end of their flight. Right now, they were already like birds startled by the twang of a bow. Any movement would cause them to feel fear. The Ming Liaodong cavalry had already lost their basic judgment. When they saw the cloud of dust behind the 5-star army, they naturally thought that the main force of the 5-star army had arrived. They had already lost their will to fight. When they heard the shouts of those who surrendered would not be killed, they didn't stop at all. One by one, they threw down their weapons, jumped off their horses, and knelt on the ground. Perhaps in the hearts of these Ming Liaodong cavalry, surrendering was not something shameful. As long as they could live, it was good. Just like on Chiyun Mountain, facing the barrage of guns and cannons, they couldn't find a way to surrender even if they wanted to. Now that the hope of living was in front of them, who wouldn't cherish it? This was like someone giving you a pillow when you were sleepy. Who would care if the pillow was suitable for your head? Zhuge Feng was already prepared for a bloody battle. In his heart, unless it was necessary, he didn't want to ask for help from the other companies. After all, he had just lost a battle and now was the time to gain merit. He didn't want to let go of this opportunity. However, he never would have thought that these Ming Liaodong cavalry would be so weak. After he jumped out with his men, they surrendered without a trace of struggle. This made him wonder if these were the elite Ming Liaodong cavalry that had surrounded his heavy cavalry regiment. While Zhuge Feng was doubting, how could the nearby 5-star army officers not be thinking the same thing? In a short period of time, it wasn't just this company that had encountered the enemy. Many of the 5-star army soldiers who were lying in ambush were also like this. The one similarity was that when they suddenly charged out, the Ming Liaodong cavalry all chose to kneel and surrender. Under the lack of morale, who knew how many people had already chosen the path of surrender? They just didn't have the opportunity to do so before, but now that the opportunity had come, of course they had to firmly grasp it. Things were far simpler than imagined. Before the sky turned dark, the battle reports from the various companies were gathered before the several commanders and division commanders. From the statistics, in just a single day's time, they captured no less than 40,000 northern Ming Liaodong Iron Cavalry. This was 40,000 people. If they wanted to capture 40,000 pigs alive, who knew how much effort it would take? From this, it could be seen that the Ming Liaodong cavalry's morale was already in chaos, and they had no will to fight. The most exaggerated thing was that they learned about the battle at Chiyun Mountain from the captives. When they learned that Yang Chendong only led 2,000 black cavalry and blocked the attacks of nearly 100,000 Ming Liaodong cavalry for more than a day and even heavily injured 40,000 people, everyone was so shocked that their jaws dropped. 2,000 against 100,000. Not only did they obtain victory, they also killed 40,000 people and forced the others to retreat. What kind of combat power did they have to be able to accomplish this? Seeing this result, even the always confident Commander Tian, who couldn't help but sigh, "The Black Cavalry is so strong that our 1st Cavalry Division can't compare." After this battle, it was completely established that the Black Cavalry was the strongest army in the entire 5-star army. Although many people knew that the reason why they won was because of the great contributions of the guns and cannons, they couldn't help but admit that just the courage of 2,000 against 100,000 was not something an ordinary person could do. In just one day, they had captured 40,000 captives. This gave the 5-star army more confidence. The only fly in the ointment was that they didn't find their commander Fang Dingshan among the captives. According to the captives, their commander was protected by another general, Mu Qiong, and 2,000 people were together. There's no need to say more. From all the facts, Fang Dingshan still hasn't broken out of the encirclement. If I were him, I would definitely choose a place to break out of the encirclement tonight. After Tian, who heard this, he expressed his thoughts in front of the new 2nd Army's commander Shi Bei and the 101st Army's commander Lu Zhua. This point coincided with Shi Bei and Lu Zhua's thoughts. After the three of them looked at each other, they finally decided that the 1st Cavalry Division would take the initiative to find the enemy. In terms of individual combat power, the 1st Cavalry Division was naturally the strongest existence. Only by taking the initiative could they achieve the goal of finding and eliminating the enemy. Okay, our new 2nd Army will take the initiative to cooperate and shrink the encirclement to prevent the enemy from escaping. Shi Bei was very convinced by the 1st Cavalry Division. He also didn't forget how they had given him war horses when he was in trouble. Shi Bei took the initiative to cooperate. Although Lu Zhua also wanted to lead the troops to gain merit, he also knew that the bigger picture was more important. He immediately made the same promise. "Many thanks. Please don't worry, our 1st Cavalry Division won't disappoint you." Tian, who took the initiative to salute Shi Bei and Lu Zhua, then strode out of the tent. Not long after, the 1st Cavalry Division's camp was bustling with activity. The army set out and disappeared into the night. 50 miles away from the encirclement of the 5-star army, in a valley called Luoshan Hill, Fang Dingshan, who had already woken up, was looking up at the sky with a worried expression. At this time, the sky was already completely dark. There were already many stars in the sky. He still remembered that at this time 2 days ago, he had close to 100,000 soldiers and was surrounded by Bugnam of Gojoseon's 2,000 cavalry. Who would have thought that in such a short period of time, the situation would become completely different? 100,000 elite cavalry had been defeated. Now, he only had 2,000 men by his side. Moreover, he had already lost his provisions. More importantly, he had lost his morale. How could he win a battle with such an army? Even if he could escape this time, even if the Daizong Emperor spared him, it would be difficult for him to do anything. He had lost his job, lost his army, and wasted countless Biming's money. How could he still have the face to live in this world? Rather than go back and be looked down upon, or even be impeached by others, it would be better to die on the battlefield. Instead, he would leave behind a heroic reputation. His right hand slowly touched the right side of his waist. However, when he touched it, he discovered that the scabbard was still there, but the blade was nowhere to be seen. At this time, he remembered that when he was unconscious, he felt the weight on his waist loosen. Now that he thought about it, his weapon should have been taken away at that time. Needless to say, this matter was definitely done by Mu Qiong. He probably already knew that he would do something, but what could he say when the other party did it for his own good? AI. With a sigh, Fang Dingshan's eyes lost all color. He was like a walking corpse. At this time, he had no hope for the future. Chapter 1342. In a large tent less than 100 meters away from Fang Dingshan, Mu Qiong was discussing the future with several generals. The army had been defeated, and it was not something that could be salvaged by saying anything. The most important thing right now was how to escape from this place. No matter what, they could not be caught. The scouts have already reported that the soldiers who tried to break out during the day have all been captured. From this, it can be seen that the five-star army has already set up an inescapable net. Even a bird would find it hard to fly out. As the host of the meeting, Mu Qiong stood at the head of the table and sighed as he spoke. His words caused the others in the meeting to lower their heads in silence. They could not escape, and surrendering was also impossible. Doing so would only implicate their loved ones in the capital. Where should they go from here? Seeing that no one spoke, Mu Qiong could guess their thoughts. Then, without any warning, he suddenly asked, "I ask all of you, are you afraid of death?" This question had been discussed countless times since ancient times. Moreover, there was no need to debate the results. Everyone was afraid of death. The only difference was to what extent they were afraid of death, and whether there were things more terrifying than death. Just like the current situation, the army had been defeated, and 100,000 elite cavalry were gone just like that. One could imagine how angry the emperor would be once he knew about this. There were also those civil officials in the court. They looked down on generals like them from the bottom of their hearts, and even privately called them ordinary people. In the past, it was the five-star army that forced them into a corner. The Daizong emperor wanted to restore the glory of the great Ming dynasty and wanted to use military power to rule the country. However, now that they had lost the battle, it was time for them to jump out and criticize the emperor. If they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to show their intelligence. If they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to elevate their status and give them enough benefits. What the result was self-evident. If he escaped back, he might be able to survive. However, his life in the future would not be any better than death. Since being alive was no better than being dead, he might as well die. Of course, the prerequisite was that their deaths had to be worth something. No one answered immediately. Instead, everyone raised their heads to look at Mu Qiong, as if they wanted to ask something. He did not answer immediately, which gave Mu Qiong some confidence. He knew that he could finally speak his mind now. He cleared his throat and continued, "If everyone is afraid of death, then there's nothing to say. Whether you're willing to surrender or break out of the encirclement, this general will not stop you. However, if you are not afraid of death and are unwilling to give up and still want to fight, this general also has a plan that can work. That is, we will fight our way back to Qian Mountain. After such a long time, I believe that Bugnam of Gojoseon will think that we have escaped far away and will definitely let down his guard. If we suddenly attack and don't give them the time to fire their guns, then it is hard to say who will win and who will lose, but at least we will have a 50% chance of winning. If you can kill Bugnam of Gojoseon, think about it. How great of a meritorious service would that be? Heavens, how is this meritorious service? This is clearly a great service." At this moment, many people sucked in a breath of cold air. Everyone had different expressions, but they quickly calmed down again. When they looked at Mu Qiong, their eyes were filled with excitement as they said, "We are not afraid of death." This showed that they were not afraid of death, which meant that they agreed with Mu Qiong's plan and were determined to fight their way back. Although there would be danger if they went back, wasn't it also more dangerous than breaking out of the encirclement? Since that was the case, why not choose to play a big game? At least if they succeeded, not only would they not be guilty, they would also have a great service. This result was within Mu Qiong's expectations. Now that he finally got a definite answer, he also let out a long sigh of relief and said, "This is good. I can see that everyone is unyielding men. Since that is the case, this general will give the order. We will have a good rest tonight and rush back tomorrow morning. When we suddenly attack at noon, we will definitely be able to kill Bugnam of Gojoseon. At that time, everyone here will become meritorious officials of the great Ming dynasty. It is not impossible for you to be conferred the title of Marquis." The great Ming dynasty had always been conferred the title of Marquis based on military merit, and the title of Marquis was hereditary. It could be imagined that once they were conferred the title, it was equivalent to having a fixed iron rice bowl. In the future, their descendants would be able to enjoy endless benefits. Mu Qiong still had some ability. With just a few words, he stirred up the fighting spirit of the generals. At this moment, they could not wait to appear at the foot of Qian Mountain and kill their way up in one go. If it were not for the fact that the army had not had a good rest these few days, they would probably have done so. Thinking that tomorrow would be the day to show off their skills, the generals excitedly left the main tent and returned to their respective camps to rest. Mu Qiong walked out of the main tent and headed straight to where Fang Dingshan was. Walking over from afar, Mu Qiong looked at the somewhat bleak figure standing there. He took a deep breath and strode forward. Fang Dingshan didn't move when he heard the footsteps behind him. He already knew who they were and even knew what they were planning and discussing. However, he didn't care about it. Even if these people were discussing about surrendering to the 5-star army, he would not find it strange. After all, when facing life and death, a person's true nature would often be revealed. How could a defeated general dare to be brave? At this moment, Fang Dingshan did not ask these subordinates to do anything. Even if these people really wanted to surrender, he would not blame them. However, he would definitely not be with these people. He had received a great favor from the great Ming dynasty, and he could only repay it with his life on the battlefield. General, Mu Qiong walked up and clasped his fists. Haha, the night sky tonight is really beautiful. Looking up at the sky, Fang Dingshan sighed emotionally. Perhaps he did not have long to live, but Fang Dingshan looked at everything so beautifully because it was very likely that he would not see it again in the future. Of course, this did not exclude the possibility that the unpolluted sky was indeed much cleaner than in the future. Yes, the night sky is very beautiful, Mu Qiong agreed, but we will probably see more of this kind of night sky in the future. Perhaps the night sky in the capital will be even more beautiful than here. When he heard the first half of the sentence, Fang Dingshan's expression did not change. However, when he heard the second half, his body suddenly trembled. He had heard many different meanings from these words. What did he mean by "it will be even more beautiful than here"? What did he mean by "the night sky in the capital will be even more beautiful than here"? Could it be that Mu Qiong was not prepared to surrender to the enemy? Could it be that he had misunderstood him? While Fang Dingshan was still thinking, Mu Qiong half knelt behind him. General, this subordinate is guilty. This subordinate should not have hidden the counterattack plan from you. This way, everyone will have a slim chance of survival. However, we cannot just leave like this. We must take a gamble. General, please punish us. Mu Qiong had to apologize. Although there were only 2,000 cavalry in the camp, Fang Dingshan was still the great general. Logically speaking, this kind of plan should not have been hidden from him. However, he was worried that his idea would not be approved. In addition, Fang Dingshan seemed to have lost his morale, so he had no choice but to go around him. Now that the plan had been decided, he naturally had to tell the truth. Fang Dingshan had already accepted his fate. He had already prepared himself to borrow a knife and commit suicide the moment Mu Qiong spoke of surrendering. He was sure that the other party would agree to this request. However, he did not expect that they would actually want to counterattack. For a moment, his expression changed continuously. He actually did not react in time. Seeing that Fang Dingshan did not speak, Mu Qiong thought that the other party did not agree. He thought to himself, then continued, General, our army has been defeated. The emperor will definitely be furious. Since that is the case, why don't we take a gamble? Once we take Bugnam of Gojoseon's head, it will be a great merit. The sacrifice of our 100,000 cavalry will be worth it. General, please grant our wish. I'll grant your wish. At this moment, Fang Dingshan really wanted to shout loudly. However, because he was too emotional, he could not say anything. Fang Dingshan still did not speak. Mu Qiong was somewhat disappointed. He even looked down on Fang Dingshan a little. Civil officials would advise to the death, while military officials would fight to the death. This seemed to be a matter of course. As a great general, he had to be prepared to die on the battlefield at any time. How could he be afraid? Mu Qiong sighed in his heart. When they were discussing the military plan, he did not call Fang Dingshan. Now that the situation had changed, there was no need to care about Fang Dingshan's attitude. In any case, he was going to give it his all. Seeing that he did not receive a response, he simply turned and left. Instead of explaining, he might as well take the opportunity to sleep a little more. That way, he would have a better mind for the battle tomorrow. Fang Dingshan finally recovered. When he found out that his general was not going to surrender, but was going to fight to the death, he was extremely happy. Now, he only wanted to get on the horse and fight with everyone. Speaking of which, his martial arts were not bad. However, When he wanted to look for Mu Qiong, he found that he was no longer there. After asking the bodyguards standing not far away, he found out that Mu Qiong had returned to his tent to sleep. Forget it. Let him rest for a night. This general will explain to him tomorrow morning. I also want to have a good sleep. Fang Dingshan was in a good mood. He was very much in favor of the military plan to counterattack and rush back to Qian Mountain. This was the only way he could fight with his life. The knot in his heart was untied. When Fang Dingshan entered the tent, he was still a little excited. Most of the night passed. When it was almost dawn, he fell asleep in a daze. Less than an hour after he fell asleep, suddenly, the sound of war drums rang out. It woke him up abruptly. Then, he heard panic shouts. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Get up quickly! Chapter 1343. At this time, outside the big tent of the northern Ming Kingdom's Liaodong cavalry, bright red 5-star flags stood in great numbers. Looking from afar, the dense cavalry had already surrounded this temporary stronghold in all directions. The 1st Cavalry Division didn't rest for the whole night. Instead, they were constantly searching for traces of the enemy. Finally, when it was almost dawn, they found a large stronghold. The commander of the 5th Cavalry Division, Gong Feng, who was in charge of searching this area, ordered his men to heavily surround this place. Gong Feng did not give the order to attack immediately. He had already made a rough calculation. There were only about 2,000 northern Ming cavalrymen that were surrounded. He had led 5 regiments of 4,000 elite cavalrymen. In terms of numbers, he had twice the number of the enemy. In terms of combat strength, he was full of confidence. What was there to be brave about? What was there to be afraid of? In the previous telegram, Yang Qindong emphasized that these original Baiming Liaodong cavalry were all elites. They had consumed a lot of money and food from the Baiming Emperor to create them. If they could be used as their own, it would save a lot of training time. Wasn't the 1st Cavalry Division going to be expanded by a division? Excellent soldiers were essential. If they captured these Baiming cavalry, it would save a lot of effort. Gong Feng, who had his own plans, didn't immediately attack. He wanted to take a look and carefully observe these Baiming cavalry. He wanted to see if they had the qualifications to become soldiers of the world's #1 cavalry army. He wanted to properly lock them up. As for whether or not these people would be able to escape from his hands, Gong Feng was even less worried. He had brought along the elite soldiers of the 5th Regiment, and he still had many excellent Big Dipper crossbows in his hands that he had yet to use. If these people were really very brave, not to mention other things, if a wave of crossbows were released, would he still be afraid that they would be able to overturn the sky? Even if they didn't have 7-star crossbows, with the 1st Cavalry Division's elite cavalry, how could they be afraid of these 2,000 Baiming cavalry? Gong Feng's face was full of pride and confidence, but when he spoke, he didn't have the slightest intention of underestimating the enemy. Men, surround this place. Don't be careless. I believe everyone understands the principle of cornered beasts fighting. Battalion commanders, go do it. Yes. The 10 battalion commanders immediately gave a standard military salute before turning around and heading back to their respective units. The camp was completely surrounded. When Fang Dingshan, Mu Qiong, and the others woke up from their tents, this was the scene that greeted them. They were surrounded by the cavalry of the 5-star army. Not far away, there was a large flag that was fluttering in the wind. The words 1st Cavalry Division of the World were written on it. Their expressions became somewhat unsightly. In the past, Fang Dingshan thought that his Baiming Liaodong cavalry was the best cavalry in the world, and that no one could match them. Naturally, he had done a detailed investigation on the elite cavalry of the 5-star army. He had naturally heard of the reputation of the 1st Cavalry Division. All this while, Fang Dingshan's wish was to find the 1st Cavalry Division and fight them. He wanted to see who was the strongest cavalry in the world. However, because the other party had been fighting in the inner region, he hadn't found a suitable opportunity. Now, he finally met them, and under such circumstances, he couldn't help but curse his bad luck. Why did they have to meet the 1st Cavalry Division when they were defeated? This way, this battle wouldn't be fair at all, and it would be extremely difficult to win, especially when he saw that the other party's troops were in formation and had already surrounded them. Fang Dingshan had a bad feeling. In comparison, Mu Qiong didn't think too much. Perhaps this was the difference between a general and a deputy general. He didn't have the ability to see through the entire battle. He was only thinking about how to get out of here because if they couldn't get out, they wouldn't be able to launch a surprise attack on Qian Mountain, and they wouldn't be able to make a last stand. Men, charge out. If we're lucky enough to get out, we'll gather at the foot of Qian Mountain. Mu Qiong was afraid that if this dragged on, their forces would fall to a freezing point, so he quickly gave the order to charge. As soon as he gave the order, the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry mounted their horses and raised their sabers. They let out a battle cry and charged in all directions without any pattern. This shocked Fang Dingshan. He didn't have enough troops to begin with, and now that they were charging in such a disorderly manner, how could they possibly win the battle? He couldn't help but cry out in alarm. Don't charge. Everyone, retreat. Retreat. Fang Dingshan's original intention was for the entire army to retreat, reorganize, and charge in one direction. With the 2,000 elite Baiming Liaodong cavalry, it was very possible for them to charge out. However, charging in such a disorderly manner was not advisable. However, no one could understand his thoughts, especially when Mu Qiong had misunderstood him. Seeing that the army was charging and Fang Dingshan was still shouting nonstop, Mu Qiong's eyes flashed with anger. What's wrong? Are you still thinking of surrendering at this time? Since you don't have any backbone, don't blame me. With this thought in mind, Mu Qiong's right hand suddenly made a sound, and the cavalry saber suddenly slashed towards Fang Dingshan's back. This was Fang Dingshan's fault. He wanted to explain what happened last night, so he purposely got closer to Mu Qiong. However, because he was too close, he didn't even have time to react when Mu Qiong suddenly attacked. His entire back was hit, and the intense pain caused him to lose all his strength. He couldn't stop himself from falling off his horse. This sudden scene shocked all of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry. They didn't think that there would be internal strife before the battle even began. However, Mu Qiong's reaction wasn't slow either. He shouted, Fang Dingshan wants to surrender to the 5-star army. My soldiers and I are loyal soldiers. How can we allow such a thing to happen? From now on, if anyone dares to talk about surrendering, they will be like this person. Come, charge out. Fang Dingshan's martial arts were quite good. He was able to become the Imperial Guard commander of the substitute emperor. He had good martial arts. In the past few years, he had trained his horse skills quite a bit. His strength had increased by a lot. If they were face-to-face, Mu Qiong probably wouldn't be able to last more than 3 rounds. However, after a successful sneak attack, Fang Dingshan was seriously injured. This scene was also heard by the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry. They knew that their general's strength was far inferior to theirs. Even when their general wanted to surrender, he ended up like this. How could they dare to have any other thoughts? After learning from the previous example, the other Baiming Liaodong cavalry weren't willing to give up their lives. After they woke up from their shock, they yelled and charged towards the neatly arranged 1st Cavalry Division's 5-star army. Prepare the crossbows. Try not to kill people. Focus on injuring people. Fire the crossbows. Commander Gong Feng, who was riding on his horse, commanded loudly. Following his order, a series of 7-star crossbows were fired at a flat angle. Their target was the first batch of Baiming Liaodong cavalry. The ancient people used bows to test their arm strength and eyesight, especially arm strength. If they didn't have enough strength, they wouldn't be able to fully draw the bow. Naturally, the power would be limited. Even if they could fully draw the bow, they would only feel tired after shooting 1 arrow. They would need to rest for a while before shooting the 2nd arrow. As the elites of the cavalry, they naturally wouldn't be so weak that they could only shoot 1 arrow. They could usually shoot 3 arrows in a row before their arms would feel numb and sore. There were even those who were born with great strength who could shoot 4 or 5 arrows. Just like the legendary Hou-Yi, he was a person who could shoot 9 arrows in a row. In the eyes of archers, he was a powerful existence. To use a bow, one must have enough arm strength. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very effective. However, with the continuous development of technology, like the appearance of the 7-star crossbow, shooting arrows became simple. One only needed to load the front of the crossbow and pull the bow to fully draw at once. Then, 7 arrows could be shot. This saved a lot of effort and had great power. Facing such a tyrannical weapon, how could the Baiming Liaodong cavalry block it? With just the sound of the trigger being pulled, the crossbow bolts rained down like rain. The 500 northern Ming Liaodong cavalry charging at the front were all shot down by the crossbow bolts. The seemingly powerful attack also stopped because of this. Then, their morale plummeted. This also caused the hundreds of Baiming Liaodong cavalry who were preparing to charge to stop. They were humans, not gods. Facing arrows that could take their lives, they had to show hesitation. This hesitation caused their morale to plummet. The Baiming Liaodong cavalry, who were still red-eyed and wanted to charge, had their combat power reduced by more than a level. This scene was also seen by Mu Qiong, who was behind them. From the moment he slashed Fong Dingshan with his saber, he had already gone crazy. Now that he saw that the front troops were injured and the middle troops were not moving forward, he was immediately enraged. "Come on, charge with me." Mu Qiong was afraid that their morale would drop, and they would lose the opportunity to charge out of the encirclement. He was prepared to charge himself and set an example.
Come.
Gong Feng also let out a loud cry. When he saw another armored general charge out from the enemy camp with less than 200 men beside him, he also laughed out loud and leaped forward. As Gong Feng rushed out, a battalion of 400 cavalrymen followed behind him. Their duty was to protect the safety of their commander. Gong Fengchong had his reasons. Just like how the northern Ming Liaodong cavalry always wanted to have a direct PK with the world's first cavalry division, how could they not have this idea? Now that the opportunity had finally appeared, Gong Feng immediately seized it and leapt out. One side had 400 people, while the other side had 200. Although there was a difference in numbers, it wasn't too big. If the Baiming Liaodong cavalry were really elite, they could make up for this difference. Just like how the 1st Cavalry Division dared to attack thousands of enemy cavalry with only a few hundred people. Chapter 1344. Both sides had a total of more than 600 people, and they quickly approached each other under the urging of their warhorses. It was a battle of life and death, which attracted everyone's attention. It could be imagined that if Mu Qiong won, the Baiming Liaodong cavalry's morale would be greatly boosted, and they would be able to unleash 100% of their strength and break out of the encirclement. On the other hand, if Gong Fengsheng won, the rest of the northern Ming dynasty's Liaodong cavalry would probably all surrender. This would save them from a battle of weapons and blood. Both sides had their own goals, and they quickly approached each other before clashing. Mu Qiong, who was the first to charge, chose Gong Feng as his target. He had already noticed that this person was different from ordinary people, and he was wearing a flashy black battle robe. Based on his experience, he should be the commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division, and if he could take down this person, it would definitely be a heavy blow to the 5-star army's morale, and it would be much easier to win. Gong Feng also targeted Mu Qiong, although he didn't know who this person was and didn't know his true identity. But judging from the armor he was wearing, his position shouldn't be too low. Only by severely injuring such a person would he be able to give the Baiming Liaodong cavalry enough respect and threat, which was what he wanted. Both of them had the same goal, and this caused the moment they met each other. The collision of their sabers caused a heart-trembling sound. Dang, dang, dang. In just one exchange, both of them slashed out 3 times, and then their bodies shook, and their horses moved to the side. The outcome of the first round was actually a draw. This was out of everyone's expectations. The difference was that Mu Qiong revealed a shocked expression. He was a famous general among the 100,000 Baiming Liaodong cavalry. Other than General Fong Dingshan and Deputy General Luo Baikuan, he didn't put anyone else in his eyes when it came to fighting. It was the same when he faced Gong Feng. In his opinion, with his strength, it wasn't impossible to take down this person in one round. But who would have thought that he wouldn't be able to do anything? Gong Feng's ability was out of Mu Qiong's expectations, and his original confidence began to fade rapidly. He began to suspect that he couldn't break out of the encirclement and leave this place. In comparison, Gong Feng's eyes were filled with fighting spirit. Yang Chendong had said more than once that there was always someone better out there. There was no such thing as the strongest. In the past, Gong Feng didn't really approve of them, especially when their opponents were Baiming cavalry. He didn't even put them in his eyes. How could these people, whose legs turned to jelly the moment they saw the Mongolian cavalry, be a match for him. And just now, after the exchange with Mu Qiong, he realized that there were also powerful people in the Bai Ming army. This reignited his fighting spirit. While he stopped looking down on his opponent, his left hand unconsciously reached for his waist. There was a saber there. It was the dual saber technique that everyone in the 1st Cavalry Division had to learn. It could be used to win and save lives at critical moments. The two of them rode back. Regardless of whether they were willing or not, another clash had begun. As the warhorses of both sides continued to accelerate, the distance between them grew closer and closer. Soon after, the sound of collisions could be heard again. In a short period of time, Mu Qiong had continuously slashed out 3 times with his saber. The first 2 of the 3 slashes were still a clash. Their strengths were equally matched. But when it came to the 3rd slash, Gong Feng seemed to have no strength to attack. He changed from slashing to blocking. Gong Feng seemed to be exhausted. When Mu Qiong saw this, he was naturally overjoyed. He originally thought that his opponent was a fierce man. If that was the case, it would be difficult for him to win. If he wasn't careful, he might even lose his life here. But this 3rd slash had reignited his hope. He used all his strength and slashed out a 4th time when the 2 horses were about to cross paths. He wanted to see how he would block the 4th slash if he already had to block the 3rd slash. Mu Qiong had a confident smile on his face, as if victory was already in sight. But this smile quickly froze on his face, because when he slashed out for the 4th time, he suddenly felt a pain in his back. Because of this, more than half of the strength in his body dissipated. The saber that he forcefully slashed out only hit the edge of Gong Feng's saber before it bounced back. This was all thanks to the fact that the 2 horses had already separated. Otherwise, if Gong Feng counterattacked while he was injured, Mu Qiong wouldn't have been able to escape even if he wanted to. The 2 horses separated for the 2nd time. The distance between them increased. When they reached a certain point, Gong Feng turned his horse around. At this moment, his eyes were glowing. Just now, he had drawn his other saber and attacked Mu Qiong with his left saber. This also meant that his next opponent was only a disabled person. Naturally, he was full of confidence. He wanted to see how his opponent would fare in the next clash. Gong Feng was in high spirits. He was ready for the next clash. Mu Qiong's expression was much worse. The back of his waist was still bleeding. His strength was also fading. If he didn't have great willpower, he might have already fallen off his horse. Mu Qiong forced himself to take a deep breath and recover his energy. As he turned his horse around, he also tore off a piece of his battle robe and wrapped it around his waist. Although this was of limited use, it could at least slow down the flow of blood. This gave him the strength to fight again. Charge! After feeling better and regaining some of his strength, Mu Qiong shouted again and charged in Gong Feng's direction. When 2 armies fought, there would naturally be chaos. Most of the time, it would be a chaotic battle. This depended on the strength of each army and their understanding of formations. But in a chaotic battle, everyone was in danger. After all, no one knew where a saber would suddenly come from and take your life. Thus, luck played a large part in a big battle. This was also why most generals wouldn't take the initiative to charge. If they were unlucky and were struck by a saber, the moment they charged into the enemy camp, wouldn't they die an unjust death? As for the battle between the generals of both sides, that was even more impossible. Think about how difficult it was to nurture a general. Why would they waste it in a one-on-one battle? That was only done in movies and TV dramas to create a tense and exciting atmosphere. But now, the real scene was really happening. Gong Feng and Mu Qiong were really in a one-on-one battle to the death. The other warriors and soldiers also saw this, but no one wanted to stop him. Perhaps they had been warned before, or perhaps they were full of confidence in their general. Since no one stopped them, Mu Qiong could only brace himself and charge forward. If it was any other time, he could retreat if he was injured and no one would say anything. But now, he was Baiming the Liaodong cavalry's morale was tied to him. If he was defeated and retreated, the result could be imagined. There would be no chance for a comeback. In order to survive, in order to appear at the foot of Qian Mountain and deal a fatal blow to Yang Chendong, Mu Qiong was going all out. Ayaya! He shouted loudly as if he wanted to convey all his strength through his mouth. Mu Qiong was getting closer and closer to Gong Feng. Then, He raised his saber high and slashed down from the sky. At this time, Mu Qiong had given up on defense. He only cared about attacking. Even if he died, he would severely injure Gong Feng to prove his strength. Gong Feng was not frightened by the other party shouting. On the contrary, he stopped his warhorse. He did not want to give the other party a chance to turn back. The other party was already injured. Next, it was time for him to expand his victory. Relying on the horse's momentum and speed, Mu Qingyuan's saber strike was not weak. With just one strike, he was able to bend Gong Feng's body, who had raised his saber to block. Mu Qiong's face flashed with a full smile. He was confident that he now had the upper hand. Next, as long as the other party relaxed, he would be able to cut Gong Feng in half. But when he still had that smile on his face, his abdomen hurt again. Another saber appeared and slashed in front of him. At this moment, Mu Qiong finally knew how he was injured, but it was too late. When blood flew out in front of and behind him, he had less than 20% of his strength left. It was already extremely difficult for him to stand on his horse. How could he have the strength to fight to the death? Due to the excessive blood loss, Mu Qiong's body became weak and his vision became blurry. Mu Qiong could vaguely see a blade coming towards the door. He instinctively wanted to dodge, but his reaction was already very slow. Just as he moved his head slightly, the blade had already landed on his neck. His aorta was cut open and blood spurted out. With a plop, Mu Qiong, who had no strength left, fell off his horse. He fell to the ground and twitched for a moment before he stopped breathing. Mu Qiong was dead. He died under Gong Feng's 2 sabers. And the moment he fell to the ground, Gong Feng had already bent over and stood up. His head was still covered in blood in his hand. A loud shout immediately rang out on the battlefield. The enemy general is dead. Do you still want to continue struggling? Surrender, and you will be spared. Surrender, and you'll be spared. The 4,000 brave soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division also shouted in unison. The 4,000 people shouted in unison, giving one a feeling of covering the sun. In that instant, some of the more cowardly Baiming Liaodong cavalry already couldn't help but throw away the sabers in their hands. Their faces were filled with horror. On the battlefield, there weren't many left of the 200 cavalry Mu Qiong brought. They didn't have enough troops to begin with, and their morale was low. How could they be a match for the 5-star army's cavalry? Not to mention, after a series of fierce battles, many Baiming Liaodong cavalry's sabers were already broken in half. They couldn't pose any threat or harm to the enemy at all. How could they possibly win without even having weapons? This was where the 5-star army's strength lay. This was especially true for an elite cavalry troop like the 1st Cavalry Division. The sabers in their hands were all forged in the Crimson City's arsenal. Be it in terms of sharpness or toughness, they were far superior to other swords. Chapter 1345. Perhaps nothing could be seen at the beginning of the collision, but after a long time, it was very common for weapons to break. The soldiers were brave, the weapons were elite, and the rewards and punishments were clear. It was hard to find anyone who could be a match for such a team. Shouts rang out from all directions. With every shout, the 4,500 cavalrymen would take a step forward. Under this kind of intimidation, killing intent surged forth. More and more northern Ming Liaodong cavalrymen threw their weapons to the ground. There were even some who were frightened by this momentum and had already dismounted and knelt on the ground, acting as if they were surrendering. Mu Qiong was killed, and his head was cut off. Now, it was on Gong Feng's cavalry sword. Fang Dingshan was injured and fell to the ground. He could no longer ride or command the army. Without their commander, the northern Ming Liaodong cavalry finally saw the situation clearly. They knew that they had lost the upper hand. Immediately, more and more of them threw down their weapons and surrendered. Of the 2,000 cavalry, 600 were killed or injured. The rest surrendered. After surrendering, Gong Feng knew what kind of big fish he had encountered this time. He had killed the 3rd fierce general of the Baiming Liaodong cavalry, Mu Qiong, and captured the Baiming general Fang Dingshan. This was definitely a great achievement. Laughing heartily, Gong Feng immediately ordered the scouts to spread the news in all directions. After that, He brought the 5 regiments of warriors and personally escorted the 1,600 northern Ming cavalrymen to the main camp. The poor Fang Dingshan was being carried under a simple stretcher. The wounds on his body had been treated, and he was no longer bleeding. His mouth was also stuffed with a piece of cloth that someone had used before, and it smelled very bad. This was not to humiliate him, but to prevent him from biting his tongue and committing suicide. On Qian Mountain, Yang Chendong and 2,000 Black Knight Dragon Guards had already finished cleaning up the battlefield. An incomparably huge dying monastery and more than 10 smaller dying monasteries had already been built. There were simply too many severed heads. It was impossible to put them all together, so they could only be divided into a dozen or so. However, it was precisely because of this that it gave off a very frightening feeling from afar. It was as if there were countless severed heads. When Division Commander Tian, who brought the First Star Army to the foot of Qian Mountain, he saw this scene. At this moment, even Division Commander Tian, who had killed countless people and never feared any enemy, had a shocked expression. He could no longer count the number of heads in front of him. Were these all killed by the Black Cavalry? They only had 2,000 people. How did they do it? Even if they used firearms, it was 2,000 against 100,000. If they were careless and the enemy cavalry charged up the mountain, the consequences would be very serious. Although he had always been modest on the surface, Tian, who was very prideful deep down, he believed that no one in the 5-star army was a match for them in terms of cold weapons. Even the Black Cavalry by his teacher's side was only on par with them. But now, this thought had to change. The Black Cavalry was the Black Cavalry. It was not something that the 1st Cavalry Division could compare to. In just this battle alone, they had killed tens of thousands of enemies. Their opponent was the Baiming Liaodong Cavalry. They were the most elite existence in the Baiming army and could be compared to the Imperial Army in the capital. This was because the Black Cavalry's main mission was to protect Yang Chendong and did not have many opportunities to kill enemies. If they were like the 1st Cavalry Division and participated in every battle, their achievements would be much greater than his. Tian, who had a frightened expression, but he did not think that it was precisely because the Baiming Liaodong Cavalry that they had strict military discipline that they left tens of thousands of corpses here. If it was any other Baiming army, most of the people would have run away as soon as the guns were fired. How could they kill so many people? On the mountain, Yang Chendong had already seen Tian, whose army appear. At this point, he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Yang Chendong was a little nervous. This was not because he was afraid that the enemy would return. With the firearms and ammunition prepared on the mountain, it would not be a problem if 100,000 enemies came. He was nervous because he did not want to kill more Han soldiers. Before, he had no choice. It was either you die or I die. Of course, he had to protect himself. Now that Tian, who had appeared here with his army, it was enough to prove that the situation was settled. At least he did not have to kill Han soldiers. This was enough to let him breathe a sigh of relief. After Tian, who arrived and saw Yang Chendong on the mountain, his expression became more respectful and he greeted his teacher. Yang Chendong could guess that Tian, who must have been shaken by the news. This was also good. He could remind him from time to time so that he would not become arrogant. Therefore, in the following time, he did not introduce too much about the Battle of Qian Mountain. Instead, he lightly skimmed over it. He only said that the Black Cavalry risked their lives and Baiming Liaodong Cavalry could not withstand a single blow. However, these words, in Tian, whose ears, made him even more frightened. The Baiming Liaodong Cavalry was the elite Baiming army. How could they not withstand a single blow? Didn't this show the strength of his teacher and the Black Cavalry under his feet? The battle on the mountain was skimmed over. Yang Chendong mainly asked about the situation below the mountain. After learning that nearly 50,000 Baiming Liaodong Cavalry had been captured, he nodded his head in satisfaction. Good. This battle was well fought. Weren't you worried about the lack of soldiers when you expanded the army? Now that you have tens of thousands of people, the problem can be solved. Yes, student, thanks teacher. Tian, whose face was filled with joy after hearing this. He believed that after the 1st Cavalry Division was expanded, its combat strength would definitely increase by a large level. The victory of the Battle of Qian Mountain meant that Baiming's military forces would completely withdraw from the grasslands. Moreover, for a certain period of time, they would not have the opportunity and ability to provoke the five-star army. With the defeat of the 100,000 Ming Liaodong cavalry, the 100,000 infantrymen led by Gao Yu in front of the beginning city became turtles in a jar. The Ming Liaodong cavalry was defeated and captured. The 70,000 reinforcements sent by Tulu City were cut off and surrounded. The Tulu City's defenders retreated. Only 10,000 of the 50,000 soldiers escaped. Nearly 40,000 soldiers were captured, and a large amount of provisions and military supplies were seized. This battle could be said to be a crushing defeat for the Ming army. At this time, Gao Yu did not know about this. He was still anxiously waiting for the reinforcements to appear. With a heart full of fighting spirit, when Gao Yu led the army out of Tulu City, everything was so smooth. Taking down Saihan Mountain and attacking the outer city of the beginning city gave him the feeling that the five-star army was just SOSO. As long as he attacked with all his strength, he could achieve great success. At that time, it would not be difficult for him to be conferred the title of Marquis. At that time, he was full of confidence and seemed to have endless strength in everything he did. But then there was a sudden change in the battle. The five-star army suddenly launched a counterattack. Like a thunder from the sky, he was completely shocked and stunned. Countless cavalrymen of the five-star army seemed to have emerged from the ground and surrounded them. Any infantrymen who dared to rush out were either killed or captured. After several attempts, and after losing more than 10,000 soldiers, Gao Yu finally became obedient. Gao Yu, who was surrounded, could only put his hope on the reinforcements at this moment. He thought in his heart that there were still 100,000 Ming Liaodong cavalry and 100,000 infantrymen who had not appeared. He still had the ability to turn the situation around. While constantly strengthening the defense of the camp, he hoped for the reinforcements to appear. But soon, 5 days passed, and he did not see any reinforcements. What was worse was that there was not much food left in the camp. The front line's attack was too smooth, and Gao Yu was a bit arrogant. The speed of the march was too fast, and the logistics could not keep up. Now, the weakness of the lack of food was finally exposed. There were more than 100,000 soldiers, and there were also tens of thousands of injured soldiers. If there was no food to eat, there was no need for the five-star army to attack. Gao Yu would not be able to survive. This kind of predicament made his face extremely ugly. He had been sitting in the tent until it was almost dark. Then, a soldier came to report that the messenger of the five-star army had arrived, and they had something to say. "The war is not over. It is not over." Hearing that the messenger of the five-star army appeared at this time, Gao Yu angrily shouted. As long as the reinforcements arrived, he could still play with the center of the camp. This was what he was counting on. After shouting for a while, the anger in his heart was almost vented. Li Keguang and Hou Xiangjia, who were standing next to him, looked at each other and nodded. Li Keguang lightly coughed and said, "Military supervisor, since they are here, why don't we meet them? Our great Ming is a nation of etiquette." "That's right. Even if we meet them, we can't lose a piece of meat. If they say something unpleasant, we can just kick them out of the tent. There's no need to get angry over them." Hou Xiangjia also smiled as he expressed his opinion. The two generals were trying to persuade him, and Gao Yu's face gradually became calm. "Okay, then I'll give you two some face and meet them. I want to see what they have to say." Gao Yu's face was normal, and he couldn't help but straighten his body. At this moment, he still paid attention to his appearance. Perhaps in his heart, he still thought that he represented the Ming Celestial Empire, and that the five-star army was nothing more than Bugnam of Gojoseon's personal product. How could a king be compared to an emperor? Li Keguang and Hou Xiangjia hurriedly gave a look to the guard who entered the tent to report. The guard immediately nodded and retreated. Not long after, a young man wearing a green military uniform with 2 bars and 4 stars on his chest walked into the tent with his head held high and his chest puffed out. The person who came in was 8 feet tall. As soon as he entered the tent, he was like an iron tower that blocked the light coming in from outside, giving people a very imposing feeling. At this moment, Gao Yu suddenly had a feeling of darkness in front of his eyes, which made him very unhappy. He opened his mouth and said impatiently, "Who is it? What business do you have with this military supervisor?" Chapter 1346. The person who came was the new 1031 SD Division's commander, Gong Pengju. This time, he was ordered by Commander Qin Feng to deliver a message to Gao Yu. Since the other party had already lost contact with the outside world, they needed to explain the situation and shatter the other party's illusions. Army Supervisor Gao, I am the commander of 1031st Division, Gong Pengju. I am here to deliver a message to Army Supervisor Gao. Gong Pengju's voice was solemn. There was no other expression on his face. There was no so-called arrogance or flattery. Gao Rang was very satisfied with Gong Pengju's attitude. What he was most afraid of was the other party's arrogance. Although he was at a disadvantage now, he still had hundreds of thousands of soldiers in his hands. If the other party's attitude was too arrogant, how could he tolerate it? Speak. Since the other party's attitude was not bad, Gao Yu was also interested to hear what they had to say. At this time, not only Gao Yu, but even Li Keguang and Ho Xiangjie pricked up their ears. Intuition told them that the messenger of the 5-star army must have something important to say. When a pin drop could be heard in the tent, Gong Pengju's voice was loud and clear. Army Supervisor Gao, just a day ago, Liaodong's 100,000 cavalry were surrounded and annihilated by Bugnam of Gojoseon. Fang Dingshan was captured. Luo Baikuan, Mu Qiong, and others died in battle. 3 days ago, our 5-star army captured Tulu City. Apart from the 10,000 soldiers who escaped to Wangquan City, the other 110,000 soldiers were captured. In other words, you are already a lone army in the grasslands. If my king's guess is correct, you don't have much food left. Considering that we are all Han, out of humanitarian reasons, your wounded soldiers can be sent out of the camp. We will arrange for people to receive them and treat them. At this time, Gao Yu's face was already very red. Intuition told him that the other party's words could be true, but he would never admit it verbally. Fang Dingshan's 100,000 Liaodong cavalry were so powerful. How could they be destroyed so easily? They must be lying to him. In a fit of anger, Gao Yu suddenly shouted, "Impossible! This is impossible! You must be trying to shake our morale, so you spread such rumors here." In the face of Gao Yu's yelling, Gong Pengju shook his head in disappointment. This time, if the Baiming army didn't listen to Gao Yu's words and took the initiative to attack, it would have taken a lot of effort to deal with them. It could also be said that Gao Yu was at least 80% responsible for this defeat. Gong Pengju, who revered the strong, naturally looked down on all these actions. However, he wasn't going to remind the enemy out of kindness. Thus, he just shook his head and cupped his fist. "Inspector Gao, you don't have to believe me. I'm here to report this news to you. As for the wounded, it's best to hand them over. Otherwise, not only will they be unable to fight, they will also consume your limited food. It's really meaningless." Gong Pengju didn't wait for Gao Yu to make a decision. He turned around and left. His goal had been achieved, and his mission was completed. As for what would happen next, he believed that as long as Gao Yu wasn't stupid, he would definitely hand over the wounded. Gong Pengju had already left. Gao Yu, who was left in the tent, had a stupefied expression. Before the messenger came, he still had some hope and ideas in his heart. But now, all of these thoughts were shattered. He suddenly realized that he was like a clown. He had become someone who had been abandoned. No, she had made the wrong decision and abandoned herself. Who was the 5-star army? If they were so easy to deal with, how could they drive Yeshin's world of Wara out of the grassland? If they were so easy to deal with, why were Annan and other countries, including the small Japanese Empire and North Korea, occupied by them? To think that he thought he was so powerful that he wanted to destroy the 5-star army. Now, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, captured, and surrounded. And all of this was because he gave the order to attack and leave the city. He was already a sinner through the ages. He could imagine how the officials and censors in the court would accuse him once the news reached Baiming's capital. The Daizong Emperor would hate him so much that even if he died now, it wouldn't be enough to make up for his crimes. Thinking that her life was completely ruined like this, Gao Yu's face was full of tears at this moment. She lay on the desk and cried loudly. This scene was seen clearly by Li Keguang and Ho Xiangjie. This wasn't good news for them. Originally, he thought that by following behind Gao Yu, with this army of hundreds of thousands, In addition to Gao Yu's background in the palace, this trip would be gilded. Once he achieved military merits, he would be willing to spend money and return with an official position. How wonderful would that be? But now, Gao Yu's army had been defeated. Not only that, from the tone of the five-star army's commander, their entire army of 400,000 was finished. What military merits did they have now? All that was left was a life and death crisis. A gentleman wouldn't stand under a collapsing wall. Although these two couldn't be considered gentlemen, they knew that life was precious. In order to survive, people like them were willing to do anything. While Gao Yu was still crying, Li Keguang and Ho Xiangjia had already quietly left the tent. Not long after, the two met in a small tent. They dismissed everyone, and when there was no one else around, they no longer had any misgivings and spoke of their worries. Since they were vile people, they didn't have any so-called righteousness or loyalty in their eyes. They only cared about benefits and their lives. In the end, the two of them discussed and decided that in order to survive, they could only do something that would let down Gao Yu. If that didn't work, they would capture this person and surrender to the five-star army. At the very least, they had to save their lives first. Due to their lack of understanding of the five-star army, the two of them didn't immediately make this decision. First of all, they didn't fully believe Gong Pengju's words. What if the other party was lying to them? What if the reinforcements really appeared? Second of all, they wanted to see if the five-star army really didn't kill captives. If that was the case, it wouldn't be too late for them to choose to surrender. Gong Pengju left. Although he didn't get a reply from Gao Yu, at least the 100,000 Ming army that were surrounded had become obedient. Since there were no breakthroughs, it was obvious that their actions were effective. Naturally, this couldn't be separated from the secret agents that the intelligence agency had arranged in the Ming army. They were either ordinary soldiers, or sergeants, or centurions. They didn't look very eye-catching. If the Ming army's battle went smoothly, even if they said something unfavorable to the army, it wouldn't have any effect. But the sound of the wind and rain was completely different. Oftentimes, a single straw could overwhelm a camel at this time. Commander of Wangquan. Information about the situation on the front line was constantly sent here. The fast horse scouts, the secret agents, the intelligence personnel of the Genie Guards, and the soldiers of the East Faction Guards were all active. Through their various efforts, in addition to the fact that Yang Qindong had no intention of covering up the news, some of the true situations were sent to Marquis Wuqing, Shi Hong, who was in charge of the formation here. At first, when he learned that Gao Yu's army was defeated, Shi Hong still had a trace of joy in his heart. You want to jump over me to take over the leadership? Now, you've suffered a defeat. Now you know why Marquis hasn't sent troops. The front line lost the battle. At least it proved that he was right. With this, Shi Hong ate an extra bowl of rice when he was eating. However, when the bad news came back, he lost his appetite. This was especially true when he learned that Tala City had been taken down by the 5 Astral Army. Of the 100,000 soldiers in the city, only 10,000 had managed to escape. The rest had been taken captive by the 5 Astral Army. He felt that the situation had spiraled out of control. Then, when he heard that even the 100,000 Liaodong cavalry led by Fang Dingshan was defeated by the 5-star army, and half of them were killed and the other half were captured, Shi Hong's face completely changed. As someone who knew the situation in the army very well, Shi Hong knew the importance of the Liaodong cavalry better than anyone else. The Great Ming dynasty lacked horses and people who were good at riding. Otherwise, how could they have watched the Tatars and Walla dominate the grasslands? Even when Gaozu was alive, although he had conquered the grasslands several times and forced the Mongolian cavalry to flee, if one looked carefully, one could still find that they won because of the bravery of the soldiers, the courage of the generals, the help of firearms, and the advantage of military strength. More often than not, they used hundreds of thousands to fight against tens of thousands of Mongolian cavalry. In the end, wasn't it because they didn't have enough war horses and too few cavalry? Now that they finally had 100,000 cavalry, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that this was the foundation of Ming's existence on the grasslands. It was because of these 100,000 cavalry that they dared to participate in the war. From time to time, they would cause trouble for the 5-star army to show their existence. If there was an opportunity, they would even bravely attack and give the 5-star army a head-on blow. This was the magic of cavalry. On the vast grasslands, they could come and go without a trace. They could use the shortest amount of time and the smallest price to do many things they wanted to do. Without these cavalry, they could only rely on their legs. There was no need to fight a war. Often, they would be tired to death. How could they cause trouble for others? What's with this Fong Dingshan? Shiheng shook his head in confusion. From the bottom of his heart, he admired Fong Dingshan very much. Although Fong Dingshan was a little greedy, he was forced to do so by the general situation. The atmosphere in northern Ming was like this. If one wanted to be a good official, he had to be filial to the academy. Otherwise, he would be dismissed. This was a common problem for Baiming and even southern Ming officials. It wasn't a problem. Moreover, Fong Dingshan was indeed good at fighting. Chapter 1347. Furthermore, this person also had a unique ability in training cavalry. Otherwise, how could he create 100,000 elite cavalry in such a short period of time? This was 100,000 cavalry. How could they be surrounded by the 5-star army and be so heavily injured? Could it be that if they couldn't win, they wouldn't run? How could Shiheng know that this wasn't a problem of running or not? Instead, Fong Dingshan thought that the opportunity had arrived and took the initiative to send himself to his death. If not, even if Yang Qindong personally took action, he would have to pay a huge price and time to deal with them. No matter what, Fong Dingshan had really lost. This was a huge matter. Thinking that his responsibility was about to become huge, Shiheng sat in front of the desk and started to write a memorial. He wanted to report this matter to the emperor and request for the emperor to send capable people to stabilize the situation in the Wangquan capital department. He also wanted to ask the imperial court for soldiers and salaries. Otherwise, if the 5-star army really attacked, how could he stop them? An urgent report was sent to the capital at the speed of 800 li. At this moment, the Baiming army was handing over 10,000 injured Han soldiers to the 5-star army. It was laughable to say that these injured soldiers were the products of the 5-star army's cavalry. Now, they needed the enemy's help to treat them. This also caused many of the injured soldiers to be filled with worry. They really didn't know what was going to happen to them. As the other Ming soldiers received the military order, they couldn't resist. They could only watch as their comrades were taken away by the 5-star army's cavalry. Their eyes were filled with an inexplicable fear and uncertainty about the future. At this moment, the morale of the Baiming army began to drop rapidly. After all, they were injured by the enemy and had to be sent to the enemy for treatment. No matter how one looked at it, there was nothing to be proud of. How could they win against such an enemy? The morale of the Baiming army continued to decline, especially during the process of handing over the wounded soldiers. Many Baiming army soldiers had worried looks on their faces. When the last wounded soldier was handed over, the Baiming army was so silent that one could hear a pin drop. If there was any sound, it would be the sound of sobbing. Everyone was worried about whether they would live or die the next day. It was basically impossible to rely on such an army to win a battle. But knowing this, Gao Yu was helpless. The food in the army was getting less and less, and it was a great waste to give it to the wounded. Although they had lost face and lost morale, at least they still had enough food to eat and wouldn't cause a mutiny in the army. This way, they could still live. This was undoubtedly the best news. In the 5-star army, Commander Qin Feng was responsible for receiving the wounded. 5 miles behind them, temporary military tents had been set up. From afar, the Red Cross symbols were very obvious. The logistics department had already received orders from the commander, Yang Si, to arrange for the hospital to be located here. Just treating the wounded was not enough. Yang Qindong had sent a telegram that he wanted to take down the Baiming army without shedding any blood. Receiving the wounded was just the first step, which was also the most likely thing to be done without causing a stir in the Baiming army. When the wounded were sent to the logistics hospital 5 miles behind them, the doctors and nurses who had been on standby for a long time all went out. Even the medical staff in the army almost all rushed here. There were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers. If there were not enough people, how could they treat them? How could they make an effect in a short time? Commander Qin Feng rode on a tall horse and was shouting, "Hurry up, immediately classify the wounded. Those with minor injuries, quickly treat them. Whoever treats them first will get a military merit. Stimulated by the military merit, all the medical staff became excited. Some of the Ming army soldiers with minor injuries even became the target of the crowd. Qin Feng did not stop all this. He just needed to maintain order and make sure that there were no problems. At the same time, he admired Yang Chendong even more in his heart. As the person in charge of the specific work, Qin Feng naturally knew Yang Chendong's plan. It was precisely because he understood enough that he was more impressed by Yang Chendong's power. He firmly believed that doing so would definitely have an effect. He was looking forward to what would happen the moment the effect appeared. In the Ming army, the wounded soldiers were sent out, but Gao Yu was still sitting alone in the tent. At this moment, the army was surrounded and the reinforcements were captured. Gao Yu, who had become an isolated army, did not know what to do. He did not dare to go out of the tent, because once he went out, he would face the sorrowful eyes of thousands of soldiers. This made Gao Yu very scared, because he did not know what these soldiers would do once they were angry. Would they come to make trouble for him? Or even kill him? He did not dare to go out of the tent, so he just hid in the main tent like a coward. He forced himself to think optimistically. Wu Qingho must have known what happened here, and he must have found a way to save him. It was also at this time that Gao Yu remembered Shi Heng's good. He also regretted not listening to him. Otherwise, he would have made mistakes. How could it be like now, where the 400,000 soldiers were destroyed and now they were in a situation where they could neither advance nor retreat? Time passed by slowly. In the 5-star Army Battlefield Hospital, the first lightly wounded soldier had been successfully treated and walked out of the camp when it was almost dark. Originally, this person's injury was not very serious. Speaking of which, this was related to Li Laoxi's good luck. The arrow shot by the 5-star Army cavalry hit his calf, making him a glorious, wounded soldier, and also avoided the bad result of fighting with the 5-star Army. Li Laoxi was born in a poor family, which could be seen from his somewhat perfunctory name. Speaking of which, in the Great Ming Dynasty, not everyone had the opportunity to learn to read and write. Only those who had accumulated merit and family property could learn to read and write. For example, Zhu Yuanzhang used to be called Zhu Zhongba. Because Li Laoxi was the 4th son in the family, he had this seemingly old-fashioned name. Li Laoxi, who had never had enough to eat, warm clothes, or good luck since he was young, suddenly changed and became the first patient in the logistics hospital to be treated. He still remembered when he appeared in the field hospital with a sorrowful expression. He didn't know what the future would be like and whether he would die. At that time, a group of doctors and nurses in white coats rushed in front of him. Yes, they rushed in front of him. He did not know what a doctor was, but he knew that they should be a doctor. As for nurses, it was the first time he heard such a name. What was even worse was that he found that these nurses were all young women, and there was no lack of beautiful women among them. Since young, Li Laoxi, who was poor, did not have many opportunities to talk about marriage, and usually, he did not have many opportunities to see women. After all, before women were married, they were particular about not going out of the house, and not taking a step out was virtuous. But now, there were so many beautiful female nurses in close contact with him, and they did not mind that he was dirty, nor did they care about how long he had not bathed, or whether there was a strange smell on his body. They rushed over and cared about him, and they even dared to touch and look around his body without any intention of disliking him. At this moment, even Li Laoxi's eyes and face turned red. For the first time, he felt ashamed of having a strange smell on his body. Presumably, this was a manifestation of his self-esteem. The doctors and nurses were not only concerned on the surface, but they were really concerned about Li Laoxi's injury. They first used a high degree of alcohol unique to Yangxie to disinfect it. Then, they tested the depth of the arrow's penetration into the skin. After confirming that it did not hurt the bones, they pulled it out with a swish. Then, they stopped the bleeding, bandaged the wound, and gave it a nutrient solution. In fact, Li Laoxi's injury was not that serious, and the arrow did not penetrate his skin very deeply. However, because there were too many examples of people who were shot by arrows and died because they pulled out the arrow, it forced others to feel a sense of fear. After a round of emergency treatment, Li Laoxi finally stood up when it was dark and could walk on his own. For this, The doctors and nurses who had received military merits were naturally very happy. There was even a nurse who was so excited that she even walked forward and hugged Li Laosi. Although this nurse was a little short and a little plump, Yang Qindong's aesthetic standards did not give her a high rating. However, in Li Laosi's eyes, it was completely different. What was a short person? Without enough nutrition, they could not even eat their fill. Being short was just a common problem in the Great Ming Dynasty. As for being a little fat, that was a good thing. With thick fat, it would be very useful to warm the bed at night. More importantly, a fat person's buttocks would also be a little bigger. That was proof that they could give birth to babies. At this moment, Li Laosi's heart was moved. At this time, when the doctor and nurse suggested that Li Laosi should go and see the surrounded Ming soldiers in a fully healed state, he agreed without any hesitation. Not only that, he also decided to follow the 5-star army in the future. If there was anything that motivated him, it would be that he wanted to marry this fat nurse. He had already heard that as long as he achieved military merits in the 5-star army and became an officer of a certain rank, he could apply for marriage. He also had the qualifications to find a female soldier as his wife if both parties were in love. Although Li Laosi did not know what it meant to be in love, he did not understand. However, he knew that he liked this female nurse, and this female nurse was not betrothed yet. All of this was enough. Li Laosi was the first to be treated. Before dawn the next day, there were more than 200 lightly injured people who walked out of their beds. They belonged to the group that did not have a lot of injuries, but they lacked sufficient medical help. When Commander Qin Feng arrived at the hospital early in the morning and saw the more than 300 Ming soldiers who could already move freely, his eyes lit up. Good job. All the medical personnel have meritorious service. Later, report the specific name list. By the way, have they finished their ideological work? Chapter 1348. The doctors and nurses who had been waiting for the results all cheered happily when they heard that they could record the merit. When they were asked if they had done a good job, everyone answered excitedly, "Yes, they are grateful for our kindness and are willing to do things obediently." The ancients were mostly kind people. Naturally, they would repay the kindness of saving their lives. Furthermore, the request made by the doctors and nurses was not excessive. They only wanted them to walk around the encirclement of the northern Ming army. It was not dangerous or tiring, and they could even repay their benefactors for saving their lives. So, why would they not do it? The answers of the medical staff made Commander Qin Feng very satisfied. He was in a good mood and immediately waved his arms and said, "Very good, let's go and prepare. All right, take out the pigs and beef and give them to the Han soldiers who have abandoned the dark side. The quantity must be sufficient." Ha ha ha. Pigs were also called porpoises in the Great Ming Dynasty. They did not have much value in the past. In the end, it was because the way they were raised was not profitable and they could not be fattened. The input and output were not proportional, so naturally, they were not paid attention to. The appearance of Yang Qindong changed everything. Not long after the boars were born, he fanned them. The pigs, who had no desires, began to eat and sleep. They had no desire to pursue a life of eating and sleeping. Naturally, their bodies also began to grow. Now, pork had become one of the indispensable meat in the entire Yangtze army. Even in the first city, there were a lot of pigs. This time, a lot of them were transported to the front line. Now, it was not difficult to take out a small portion to provide for more than 300 wounded people. The more than 300 wounded people who had basically recovered had something in their hands. Some were holding a pig's trotter, some were fat pig's knuckle, and some were holding delicious beef. Under the protection of the cavalry of the 5-star army, they walked towards the encampment of the Ming army. The originally listless and unmotivated Ming army camp suddenly had a lot of cavalry of the 5-star army outside, which immediately attracted everyone's attention. Under the heavy encirclement, the Ming army did not need to train anymore. This way, they could save some food. They, who had nothing to do, suddenly found something interesting to watch. They quickly gathered together and stared at the slowly approaching 5-star army cavalry. The 5-star army's cavalry approached as if there was no one around. When the two sides were only 150 paces apart and were about to reach the range of the arrows, the cavalry stopped advancing and began to line up on both sides. In this way, the 300 or so Ming army soldiers who had recovered from their wounds appeared in front of everyone. They were all tearing up the meat in their hands, and their faces were filled with satisfaction. This sudden scene naturally aroused the curiosity of the Ming soldiers. They didn't know what the 5-star army was up to, so they just watched with wide eyes. But as he watched, he suddenly heard a shout. "Hey, isn't that Zhangqi? Wasn't his arm injured? That arrow was still stuck in his arm yesterday. Why does it look like nothing happened now?" "That's Li Laosi. We're from the same hometown. He was shot in the calf, but why is he moving freely now?" "That's Qiao Shi too. He was also shot in the calf." But shouts sounded one after another. Only then did everyone realize that the people who appeared here were the wounded soldiers who were sent out yesterday. They were also their comrades. They were still wounded yesterday, but now, not only had their bodies recovered, they were even eating and drinking. This scene stimulated many people. Some of the soldiers who were useless, or who had not eaten their fill, couldn't help but swallow. It was obvious that they were hungry. Li Laosi and the others were like giant pandas being watched by people. They stood there and walked back and forth, trying their best to show off their abilities. Of course, their mouths weren't idle either. They kept eating and looking very happy. The display didn't last very long. In less than an hour, the 5-star army cavalry retreated with the 300 or so Ming prisoners. They didn't speak on the way here, but when they left, they shouted, "If there are any more wounded soldiers, our 5-star army will continue to receive them." The 5-star army finally left. The remaining Ming army soldiers looked at each other. They didn't know what to do. If they didn't fight, where would the wounded soldiers come from? Were these words passed down wrongly? However, there were also some astute people. After their eyes kept rolling, a ruthless look flashed past, as if they had made some kind of decision. Not long after, more than an hour, many wounded soldiers suddenly appeared in the barracks. They had some knife wounds on their arms or legs. In their own words, they accidentally injured themselves when they were training hard. In order to save food, Gao Yu had already ordered that there was no need to train. However, there were still people who took the initiative to train and got injured. Even the slowest person would know what had happened. How could it be an accident? It was clearly intentional. It was hard for these people. In order to pretend to be wounded soldiers, they were so ruthless that they used their own bodies to cut themselves. At the same time, some ruthless soldiers followed suit. The number of wounded soldiers in the Ming army began to increase. Before noon, there were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers, and this number was still increasing. When the results were reported to Gao Yu in the main tent, he only blinked a few times and knew what had happened. Although he didn't step out of the tent as an embroidered uniform guard, he still placed a lot of spies outside to ensure that he would know immediately if something important happened. Of the wounded soldiers who were sent away yesterday, more than 300 of them were healed today. Of course, he knew about this. He had also lamented the strength of the 5-star army's logistical support. At least in this aspect, the Ming army couldn't do it. However, it was just a sigh. In Gao Yu's eyes, the thing that the great Ming dynasty didn't lack the least was people. Especially after Ren Xuanji's rule, the great Ming dynasty's population had nearly doubled. In the eyes of the officials, people were the most worthless existence. The 5-star army expended a lot of effort to heal the wounded. This was a waste of resources, and it must have cost a lot. With this money, wouldn't it be better to build a new army? With this mentality, Gao Yu didn't take this matter to heart. It wasn't until he heard the report that there were more than 10,000 wounded soldiers in the army, and the number was still increasing, that his face changed greatly. Gao Yu wasn't a brainless person. On the contrary, his thoughts were very active, and he quickly figured out the truth of the matter. It was because of this that he was very angry. In order to openly surrender to the 5-star army, these soldiers actually had the courage to harm themselves? At this time, Gao Yu wanted to give the order to not send the wounded soldiers to the 5-star army's barracks. He wanted to see these soldiers fall into a trap of their own making. However, he quickly shook his head. At this time, it was easy to neglect, but not easy to stop. Otherwise, a mutiny in the army would be unavoidable. Thinking that there wasn't much food left in the army, it would be better to send these soldiers who didn't have any integrity out. They could save a lot of food. Thus, he simply waved his pen and agreed to send these wounded soldiers to the five-star army's barracks. At night, more than 18,000 Ming soldiers with all kinds of minor injuries were sent back to the barracks by the five-star army's cavalry. When the other Ming army soldiers saw this scene, they fell into deep thought. As a result, on that night, more than 70,000 wounded soldiers were sent back to the barracks. This was a serious injury to his muscles and bones. Currently, Gao Yu only had 130,000 soldiers. If these 70,000 soldiers were sent away, he would only have less than 50,000 soldiers left. How could he contend against the five-star army with such a small amount of soldiers? He was afraid that once the enemy charged over, he would be finished. However, if he agreed, wouldn't he be digging his own grave? If he didn't agree, he was afraid of a mutiny in the army. At this moment, Gao Yu realized that he had overestimated the loyalty of these soldiers to Bai Ming. Did he think that only a few soldiers with no moral integrity would surrender? Gao Yu didn't know what integrity was. When a person didn't even have enough to eat, what integrity was there to talk about? If you tried to talk to him, it would be a light punishment if he didn't beat you until you couldn't take care of yourself. Gao Yu was having a headache. Li Keguang and Ho Xiangjia were also having a headache in a general's tent not far from the main tent. They had previously thought of surrendering to the five-star army in order to survive. In fact, they had even made up their minds to tie up Gao Yu and surrender to the five-star army. But now, the situation had suddenly changed. Countless wounded soldiers had appeared. It seemed that they didn't need to tie people up to achieve their goal. The five-star army treated the wounded extremely well. They didn't even kill normal soldiers. As generals, they shouldn't be killed so easily. Why don't we stab ourselves too? Ho Xiangjie thought about it and discussed with Li Keguang. How can we do that? Our bodies, hair, and skin were all given to us by our parents. How can we do something like self-harm? How can we face our parents who raised us? Li Keguang said righteously. However, only he knew that he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Ho Xiangjie was reprimanded, and his face was a little red. How could he bring himself to do it? He just couldn't think of a way, so he gave it a try. Then, what should we do? There are more than 70,000 wounded soldiers. Once we surrender, we'll be done for. Without an army, even if we're captured by the five-star army in the end, we won't have any merits. No merits? This answer made Li Keguang very unhappy. He shook his head. No, we're generals. How can we be the same as other people? Even if we surrender, the five-star army still has to earn merits. Are we really going to go against our superiors? Ho Xiangjie said with a bitter face. Chapter 1349. When Li Keguang heard that they were going against their superiors, a trace of hesitation appeared in his eyes. However, he quickly clenched his teeth and said, "This isn't us going against our superiors, but rather, we're rescuing Army Supervisor Gao. Think about it. Even we can see the current situation clearly. How smart is Army Supervisor Gao? How could he not see that the situation is hopeless? He didn't surrender only because he didn't want to lose face. Since that's the case, why don't we fulfill his wish?" Fulfill his wish? Ho Xiangjie had already thought of a certain possibility. Yes, fulfill his wish. How about this? We'll go find the other generals and say that Army Supervisor Gao doesn't agree to send these 70,000 wounded out. He wants to fight to the death with the five-star army. That way, they'll definitely listen to us. You and I can bring over 100,000 people to surrender to the five-star army. It'll definitely be a great merit. Li Keguang said as if he had made some sort of decision. Since they wanted to make a contribution, they had to make ample preparations and succeed in one strike. Li Keguang had clearly made enough preparations and thought about a lot of things. Ho Xiangjie, who had always followed Li Keguang's lead, knew that he didn't have a choice. Moreover, he also had the same thoughts. He immediately nodded heavily. "All right, I fully support Brother Li. I'll do whatever you say." "Then let's gather the generals." Li Keguang's eyes carried a trace of ferocity. In order to survive, in order to make a contribution, he had made up his mind. Not far away in the tent, Gao Yu was still having a headache. The changes in the army were beyond his expectations. He was somewhat at a loss. Who knew if more wounded people would appear tomorrow after handing over these 70,000 people? If they all surrendered, he would become a general without an army. Then, what was the point of holding on? Just as he was feeling conflicted, a burst of noise suddenly came from outside the tent. This made Gao Yu, who was already in a bad mood, couldn't help but shout loudly, "Who's making a racket outside the tent?" Gao Yu was the army supervisor and now the highest-ranking general in the army. When he was angry, he still had some dignity. However, this time, he had clearly miscalculated because the tent's curtain had already been lifted from the outside. Then, armored Li Keguang, Ho Xiangjia, and the others appeared in front of him with blades. Looking at the military uniforms in his hands, Gao Yu was still somewhat puzzled. What were they trying to do? Was there going to be a big war? Why was his commander completely unaware of this? While he was in a daze, Li Keguang suddenly pointed at him and said, "Come on, tie him up." As soon as he finished speaking, 4 big men rushed forward. Before Gao Yu could resist, they had already held him down and put him on the rope. Gao Yu was also a martial artist, so it was not easy for him to be restrained so easily. However, the person who came was too fast. When he was tied up, he was still a mess. Only when he felt that his arm could no longer move did he remember something. He shouted, "Li Keguang, you dare to rebel? Do you want to be exterminated?" "All right, Inspector Gao, you don't have to shout anymore. As the saying goes, a wise man submits to circumstances. This general brought everyone here to save you. Now, shut his mouth. We'll talk about it again when he thinks clearly." Of course, Li Keguang was afraid that his family would be exterminated. However, this time, he had already convinced the generals. Everyone made the decision together and even signed their names. With this evidence, even if the imperial court questioned them, everyone's words and deeds would be the same. Then, when the imperial court found out about this matter, would they punish everyone? Would the imperial court do this? In Li Keguang's opinion, they would not. Now, the imperial court was in need of people. If they really did this, it would only disappoint the generals. What's more, the Li family had some influence. Together with the other generals, they weren't an existence that could be bullied by anyone. Of course, after surrendering to the 5-star army, Li Keguang also had to rely on Bugnam of Gojoseon's help to intercede. With this two-pronged approach, he was naturally relieved. Gao Yu was tied up tightly. That night, there were many more people on night duty in the Ming army camp. At dawn, a fast horse left the camp, carrying the integrity and request of Li Keguang and others, and went straight to the 5-star army. Gao Yu was actually arrested. After Qin Feng saw the letter sent by the Ming messenger, he was somewhat surprised. However, after thinking about it carefully, everything was reasonable. Surrendering was, of course, a good thing. However, Li Keguang and others also made their own request. That was, they wanted Bugnam of Gojoseon to intercede in front of the Ming emperor for them. At least, they would not make things difficult for their families. Regarding this, Qin Feng did not dare to make a decision on his own. He immediately asked the messenger to wait for a moment. He used the radio to ask for instructions from Yang Chendong. Not long after, the message came back. Yang Chendong agreed to these people's request. He would also write a letter to the Ming emperor to intercede for Li Keguang, Ho Xiangjia, and other family members. As a defeated general, Zhu Qiyu would definitely not ignore the importance of this letter. Yang Chendong firmly believed in this point. After the messenger got a positive answer, he returned to the camp with joy. At this point, the last Ming army on the grassland had all surrendered. In this battle, except for 10,000 people who escaped from the Ming army, the rest of the 400,000 people were all killed or captured. In comparison, Ming's military strength fell into a disadvantage. Yang Chendong returned triumphantly with 2,000 black cavalry and came to the first city. In the palace of the first city, Yang Chendong first met with a group of generals and praised their performance. Then, those who should perform meritorious deeds should perform meritorious deeds, and those who should be rewarded should be rewarded. After the generals retreated, Yu Mian, the lord of the first city, stood in front of Yang Chendong. Next to him was Tiger's Mane, the commander of the new army, and Yang Si, the commander of the logistics command. "You've worked hard," Yang Chendong said with a satisfied expression as he looked at these 3 trusted subordinates. Young master, sixth young master, has worked hard. The three of them did not dare to claim credit and quickly replied respectfully. All right, we're not outsiders, so let's be casual. Now on this grassland, there's no Biming army coming to cause trouble, and there's no Walla and Tartars harassment. Next, it's a period of great development. Are you ready? Yang Chendong asked with bright eyes. Sixth young master, as you said, everything is ready. Yu Mian replied with cupped fists. Yang Si, who was at the side, also had an excited look on his face. Young master, the people are in place and the tools are ready. We're just waiting for the order. What the two of them were talking about was what Yang Chendong had mentioned before. The silver mineral reserves on the grassland were astonishing. In the future, the Mongol Empire had benefited a lot from this place. Now that they had not appeared, and it was impossible for them to appear, these benefits naturally belonged to Yangxia. Just in this area alone, in terms of copper mines, in the future, it was known as China's 6 great copper veins. Its reserves and quality were the best in the world. In the Great Ming Dynasty, almost all of the Great Ming Dynasty's copper veins were in the hands of the imperial court. Yang Xie tried his best, but it was difficult to obtain them. But now, it was different. Occupying this place was equivalent to having more mines. Not only that, but there were also large amounts of lead, zinc, cobalt, gold, and silver mines. This was a huge treasure trove. Yang Chendong didn't dare to do it before because there were too many uncertainties. If he couldn't guarantee safety, once the enemy appeared during the mining process, wouldn't he be making a wedding dress for others? Now that Biming's army had been defeated, there were no other decent enemies here. The matter of mining could finally be brought up to his daily work. Good. I'll leave this matter to the three of you. Just follow the map. Believe in this, Prince. The results will definitely surprise you. Yang Chendong laughed loudly. After finishing this important matter, Yang Chendong talked about the Southern Ming Dynasty. We have won this battle. The request we made before will not change. 1 million people of the Great Ming Dynasty must be sent over. Then, you can choose a few suitable people and send them to Crimson City. Also, there is no need to return these hundreds of thousands of Biming prisoners. If they must, Gao Yu and a few other generals can be sent back, but not a single soldier. Understand? This was Yang Chendong's arrangement for returning to Crimson City. Speaking of which, it had been more than 2 years since he left Crimson City. His wife and children were there, as well as many developing munitions factories. There were also too many things that he needed to worry about, so he had to go back. Tiger's Man and the other two naturally knew that the 6th young master was going back to Crimson City. Such military secrets would not be hidden from them. The three immediately knelt down and kowtowed. I wish the young master a safe journey and good health. Haha, good. I'll take advantage of your auspicious words. I'll leave the matters here to you. After laughing loudly, Yang Chendong immediately let Beta Persei attend the banquet. For a moment, the guests and the host were happy. On the morning of the 3rd day, Yang Chendong left the first city with 2,000 black cavalry and headed towards the 3 eastern provinces. Biming's capital. In the throne room, there was a solemn atmosphere. A memorial was scattered on the ground, and the words written on it were floating everywhere. All the officials did not even dare to breathe loudly. Zhu Qiyu was really angry. Although he was able to obtain the throne, it was inseparable from the support of all the officials. However, the battle report sent by Marquis Shi Hong had angered him. At this moment, he was standing in front of the golden dragon throne with his hands on his waist. He looked like a shrew who was cursing in the street. The battle report was sent by Shi Hong. It was about the defeat of the Biming army after they left Tulu City. Even though the situation regarding the aftermath hadn't arrived yet, just the news that the 5-star army was attacking Tulu City and that the city was already in danger was enough to make Zhu Qiyu's rage overflow to the heavens. Everyone knew that once Tulu City was lost, the 400,000 soldiers of northern Ming would be like children without a mother. Unless they could take down Shi City, the 400,000 soldiers would not be able to return due to the lack of rations. All the ministers in the hall who had some brains naturally saw this. It was precisely because of this that no one dared to speak out. Chapter 1350. Say what? Tulu City was thousands of miles away. Now that there was a problem, it was too late to say anything. As for ordering the army to reinforce, Wu Qinghe was in the Wanquan City division. He should have gone to help, but he didn't because he had no soldiers at his disposal. What else could the others do? No matter what he said, it would be too late to do anything. The hall was silent, but Zhu Qiyu didn't vent his anger. He continued to glare with bloodshot eyes, his face filled with unwillingness as he roared, "Say something! Say something! Aren't you all quite powerful? The words of the Holy Sun come out of your mouth. Now that the country is in trouble, is there anyone who can share our burden?" The hall was still silent. This was war, and people would die. It wasn't some ordinary task. If they couldn't do it well, they could think of a way to make up for it, or even find an excuse to make someone else take the blame. But on the battlefield, if they lost, they would be captured if they didn't die. How could there be room for excuses? Who wasn't afraid of death? This was especially true for the ministers who were used to the emperor's grace. They lived in luxury every day, only wishing that their days would be a bit slower. Who would take the initiative to seek death? The civil officials didn't say anything, and the generals were the same. No matter how powerful a general was, in the face of such a decline, what could they do? War required planning, which involved mobilizing troops, provisions, supplies, and familiarizing oneself with the situation of the army. Only then could one calmly make arrangements. But the attack on Tulu City was an unexpected situation. Who could turn the tide in such a short time? Not to mention that the generals had already been suppressed by the civil officials and lacked courage. Even if they had the ability, by the time they gathered the army and rushed to Tulu City, the city would have been occupied by the 5-star army. They had already suffered defeat before the battle had even begun. How many people could bear the consequences? If they didn't go to war, they would only be cursed for being useless. Once they stepped forward to lead the army, they would undoubtedly be defeated. When the time came, not only would they have to bear the responsibility and be cursed, but it was also possible that their family would be exterminated. If that really happened, they would be the true sinners of their families. Everyone had their own thoughts, and no one had the courage to stand out. Zhu Qiyu, who was standing in front of the golden dragon throne, was deeply disappointed. Looking at these people who usually shouted, "Long live the emperor," and claimed that they were willing to die 10,000 deaths for the emperor, at this moment, they had all become mutes and decorations. That deep sense of disappointment made him feel as if a knife was being twisted in his heart. Xiao Qin wanted to continue cursing, but after thinking about it, there was no point in doing so. He turned his head to the chief eunuch, Jin Ying, and said, "Let's end the court session. The officials of the 6 ministries will stay." Court is dismissed. Jin Ying, who was also pale with fright, hurriedly nodded as if she had heard the voice of heaven. Then, she announced the end of the court session. Soon, only the ministers of the 6 ministries were left in the originally crowded hall. Ever since the great Ming dynasty was divided into the north and the south, Zhu Qiyu, the acting grandmaster, abandoned the cabinet and directly handed over the specific matters to the 6 ministries' ministers, letting them be responsible for themselves. By doing so, he could naturally concentrate all the power on himself, but it was really tiring. Usually, he had to read memorials until midnight every day. Usually, after resting for more than 2 hours, the sky would brighten and it would be time for morning court. For the sake of the great Ming dynasty's revitalization, Zhu Qiyu suffered all the hardships. However, the effect was not obvious. Although it seemed that he had the support of the Zhu family's bank and now had money and soldiers, he would always suffer a great loss whenever he faced the 5-star army. Previously, it was still okay, and the loss of soldiers and generals was within an acceptable range. However, this time, it involved an army of 400,000. His heart really ached. At this moment, the ministers of the 6 ministries were standing below the throne room. Each of them had their heads lowered like primary school students who had made a mistake. Zhu Qiyu looked down at the 6 ministries' ministers. His mood was not very good, especially when his gaze landed on the Minister of Rights, Hu Shao. A wave of anger rose from the bottom of his heart. This person had married his granddaughter to Yang Qindong. If someone said that such a person could be loyal to him, he definitely would not believe it. However, as the oldest official in the court, Hu Shao could be said to have done things flawlessly. In addition, he had always been very popular, so it was not easy to find fault with him. Of course, he was just a minister. It was not difficult for Zhu Qiyu, who already had all the power in his hands, to remove him. However, he was worried. He was worried that if he suddenly stabbed Hu Shao, it would incur the wrath of Yang Chendong. Although the five-star army was strong, looking at its history, they had never found trouble with Bai Ming. On the contrary, it was always him who took the initiative to provoke them. Could it be that the five-star army did not have the strength to do so? Zhu Qiyu did not think so. The reason why the other party did not make a move was because he had too many misgivings. For example, the members of the Yang family. Yang Chendong's brothers and sisters were all in the capital. Also, wasn't this Hu Shao an existence that he was afraid of? As an emperor, he could not let his emotions affect his decisions. He had to consider all the relationships and take the big picture into consideration. Take this Hu Shao, for example. Although Zhu Qiyu knew that he could not sincerely use him, given that he had not done anything to harm Bai Ming's interests, Zhu Qiyu could only tolerate him for now. Fortunately, as the countries around Bai Ming were all under Yang Chendong's control, the Bureau of Rights was of little use. Whether or not it was, there was not much difference. Zhu Qiyu lightly coughed and turned his attention to the other ministers. Sweeping his gaze around, he said, "My beloved subjects, it is time for everyone to come up with a plan for how to deal with the siege of Talu City." There were too many people in the hall, and I presume that my beloved subjects did not want to say anything. Now that there are no outsiders, we can say whatever we want behind closed doors. We will pardon all of you. Zhu Qiyu's tone was amiable, and his voice was gentle. Yes, I was not angry when you did not express your stance. After all, there were too many people, and what if you said something wrong? But now, there is no one else here. If you have any ideas, feel free to say it. Regardless of whether it is right or wrong, you are not wrong. It was not easy for Zhu Qiyu to use such a tone. At the same time, he looked at the 6 ministers expectantly, waiting for them to come up with a plan to solve the problem. Reality disappointed him once again. The hall fell into silence again. The 6 ministers were like mutes. They lowered their heads and did not speak. It was as if there was a beautiful pattern on the ground that was worth studying. Zhu Qiyu endured it when everyone did not speak up. But now, he had already said so much, but no one said a word. This was somewhat unacceptable. If it wasn't for the fact that he was in dire need of manpower and it wasn't appropriate to make a big fuss about it, he was afraid that he would have to teach these 2 people a lesson today to intimidate them. Forcibly suppressing the anger in his heart, he finally decided to listen to everyone's opinions by name. Didn't you all say nothing? Then I will ask one by one. Let's see if you still dare to not speak. His gaze first fell on the Minister of Personnel, Wang Zhi. He was a big shot in charge of human resources. Since it was a war, he naturally had to choose a general first. Asking Wang Zhi was a matter of course. Naturally, when he saw Wang Zhi, Zhu Qiyu was also angry. He would not forget that this person's grandson, Wang Xizheng, had learned Yang Chendong's teachings. He should be teaching at the headquarters of Yang Chendong, the place called Qiqian City. Such a person would probably be disloyal. Shaking his head, Zhu Qiyu threw these undesirable thoughts aside. Forget it. Speaking of which, all the civil and military officials in the imperial court were once officials of the same court as Yang Chendong. Was he going to investigate them and remove them from their positions? Suppressing the anger in his heart, he looked at Wang Zhi and said, "Minister Wang, tell me your opinion." Wang Zhi, who was called, finally raised his head with a puzzled expression. When he saw that Zhu Qiyu was serious, he shook his head. "This old minister has no objections. Everything will be decided by your majesty." No objections? Hearing Wang Zhi's reply, Zhu Qiyu was really angry. Since you have no objections, then what are you saying? But when he thought about it, it seemed that he was the one who forced the other party to say it. But did he really have no objections? You are the Minister of Personnel, the so-called heavenly official of the Ministry of Personnel. All the officials in the world are under your control. What did you mean by saying that you have no objections? Zhu Qiyu's expression kept changing, but it quickly returned to normal. He could actually understand Wang Zhi. Under his suspicion, it would be inappropriate for him to propose any candidate at this time. Perhaps even if he proposed a suitable candidate, he would not approve it. Since that was the case, what was the point of saying more? Just when Zhu Qiyu thought that he had thought everything through, Wang Ji suddenly spoke again. Your Majesty, this subject is old and has not been sleeping well recently. There are many things that I am unable to do. Therefore, I would like to resign and retire to the countryside. Your Majesty, please grant me permission. Wang Ji actually resigned. This was somewhat out of Zhu Qiyu's expectations. Out of a conspiracy theory, he could not help but wonder if this was the other party's way of retreating. But when he thought about it, it was not very likely. After all, it was not good for one's reputation to submit one's resignation when the country was in danger. Unless such a person was no longer an official, his reputation would definitely take a hit. Who would listen to such a person's words in the future? If that was the case, this Wang Ji really wanted to resign. Sighing in his heart, Zhu Qiyu had already decided to agree. After all, both parties were suspicious of each other. This job was not easy to do. Since that was the case, it was better to let him leave. Sometimes, he did not reply. He could not possibly agree immediately when the other party said that he wanted to resign. Wouldn't that make others misunderstand that he wanted the other party to leave? His gaze shifted from Wang Ji to the Minister of Works, Shi Pu. Logically speaking, this was a military issue, and the Minister of Works had nothing to do with it. However, the cannons and firearms that accompanied the army this time were made by the Ministry of Works. Now that the army was defeated, did that mean that the Ministry of Works did not do a good job? Chapter 1351. When Shi Pu's name was called, he immediately knelt on the ground. Your Majesty, this old subject is guilty. This old subject deserves 10,000 deaths. Zhu Qiyu frowned when he didn't even say anything. Why did Shi Pu have such an attitude? Zhu Qiyu frowned, but the other party quickly gave him an answer. Your Majesty, a 5-star military fire weapon is so powerful that it's not something we can compare with. In terms of firearms alone, we're not their match at all. Shi Pu almost cried for real. It was evident that he knew his weapon was inferior to the other parties. Speaking of which, compared to the technology and weapons brought by Yang Chendong, it would be more shocking if the Ministry of Works could produce similar products. Shi Pu was naturally aware of this point. Afraid that he would be punished for this, he took the initiative to bring it up. His kneeling caused Zhu Qiyu to lose the idea of asking him for a plan. This kind of person was already frightened by the 5-star army. Could he still rely on him to come up with any good ideas? Shaking his head, Zhu Qiyu wanted to call for another minister. But at this time, the Crown Prince's junior tutor, Grand Scholar and Minister of Justice, Su Yozhen, spoke without being asked. Your Majesty, this subject believes that it will be difficult to solve the siege of Lu City. Finally, someone took the initiative to speak. Zhu Qiyu was happy in his heart. When he looked at Su Yozhen, his tone became much gentler. Beloved official Su, please continue.
Yes.
Su Yozhen cupped his fists with a solemn expression. Your Majesty, the bravery of the 5-star army is unimaginable. With their firearms, I'm afraid that by the time the memorial reaches the capital would have already fallen into their hands. For a city that has already been conquered, it would be useless no matter how much effort we put in. Rather than this, why not place the all-encompassing department on the front lines and increase the number of troops there while considering the matter of negotiating with the 5-star army? No tribute, no land, no reparations, no political marriages, and no titles of kings with different surnames. These were the great Ming's strength of character. It was a pity that after the great Ming divided the South, its strength was not as strong as before. Many rules had also changed. Let's talk about not being conferred the title of king. Where did Bugnam of Gojoseon come from? Since he had already broken the ancestral rules, what harm was there in breaking a few more? This was what Su Yozhen meant when she proposed to negotiate with the 5-star army. After saying all this, he took a step back. He knew that some things needed to be considered. The more he said before that, the more mistakes he would make. Sure enough, when Zhu Qiyu heard that they were going to negotiate with the 5-star army, her face became very ugly. An ominous glint flashed in his eyes, representing the anger in his heart. As the saying goes, If the monarch is humiliated, his subjects will die. However, when he looked at the other 5 ministers, their expressions didn't change at all. It was as if Su Yozhen's words were nothing out of the ordinary. The hall fell into silence once more, and only the sound of Zhu Qiyu's heavy breathing could be heard. Zhu Qiyu was originally an ambitious emperor. Ever since he took the position, he had been diligent in government affairs. It could be seen from the fact that he had less than 6 hours of rest every day. Unfortunately, one of the biggest lies in the world was that if you worked hard, you would succeed. This was because many people were indeed very capable, but they always lacked a bit of luck or talent. In the end, their wishes didn't come true. Zhu Qiyu belonged to the type of people who were very unlucky. Not to mention that in history, he was overturned by Zhu Qizhen. Just the fact that he met Yang Qindong in this life had already determined his fate. No matter how hard he worked, he wouldn't be able to unify the great Ming. The result of his hard work was that Ming would be destroyed a little later than usual. With the difficulty in front of him, Zhu Qiyu naturally didn't want to lower his head. However, reality was so cruel. The 5-star army was so powerful. If he still stubbornly insisted on going against the 5-star army, he might even lose his family fortune. He might even lose the throne. This situation was so big that he had to consider it carefully. Could he really afford to gamble? He had the heart to kill the enemy, but he was powerless to reverse the situation. This sentence was the most appropriate to describe Zhu Qiyu. When a person's strength wasn't strong, even if they were angry, they couldn't do anything. Moreover, if one wanted to achieve great things, they couldn't let their emotions affect their decisions. Thinking about Ming's current situation, even if he wanted to mobilize the army, it would take time. Moreover, their fighting strength was so weak that even Zhu Qiyu didn't have confidence. In the end, after a long sigh, Zhu Qiyu's mood began to stabilize again. Su Yozhen, who had been secretly observing, saw that Zhu Qiyu's mood was gradually stabilizing. She took a small step forward and said, "Your Majesty, a little impatience spoils great plans." Su Yozhen's actions were just to give Zhu Qiyu a way out. After hearing this, Zhu Qiyu sighed and said, "That's right. Beloved official Su is right. The strength of the 5-star army isn't something we can fight against without making preparations. Since it's like this, let's talk with them. Didn't they say they wanted 1,000,000 commoners last time? Let's discuss this matter and see if it can be done." Although it was a question, the fact that Zhu Qiyu was able to say these words already proved that he approved of this proposal. Otherwise, why would he casually mention it? It had to be said that the so-called commoners in the eyes of the emperor mostly referred to the commoners that could be seen. For example, the officials in the palace hall, as well as the gentry and nobles who could submit memorials from time to time. After all, the emperor lived in the palace all year round. What was the outside world like? How were the commoners living? All of this was nothing more than hearsay, and a basic impression he got from reading the memorials. Most of the time, the so-called world peace and prosperity in the history books referred to the officials, scholars, and country gentry living a good life. As for the commoners at the bottom, at least before the establishment of China, they didn't have enough to eat and wear. Without a clear understanding of the commoners, it was impossible to understand the true pain of handing over 1,000,000 commoners. In Zhu Qiyu's eyes, all of this was just a number. It was still the same sentence. The foundation of the great Ming dynasty was still there. It was just 1,000,000 commoners at the bottom, so it was fine to pay. As long as the emperor and the officials could live well, what did this matter? Zhu Qiyu had never taken the people at the bottom seriously and had never treated them as human beings. Only then did Zhu Qiyu casually ask this question. In that instant, the eyes of several people from the 6 ministries lit up. They knew that the time for them to speak had come. As if he was afraid that Zhu Qiyu would look down on him, the Minister of Revenue, Jin Lian, who wanted to make his presence known, was the first to stand up. "Your Majesty, this matter can be discussed. However, the topic needs to be changed. This isn't because we fear Bugnam of Gojoseon and want to give them 1,000,000 commoners. Rather, under the other party's request, we want to reward Bugnam of Gojoseon with the magnanimity of the Celestial Empire." The ancient people cared a lot about face. They opened their mouths and spoke of benevolence and righteousness. It wasn't a problem to ask them to hand over 1,000,000 commoners. but if they were forced to do so, then it didn't make sense. Who knew how the history books of later generations would scold them? Even if it was for the sake of their reputation, they had to cover it up. Zhu Qiyu naturally approved of this. He didn't want the people of later generations to scold him as a fatuous ruler. As a result, he nodded and said, "That's right. Beloved official Jean is right. Then I'll leave this matter to you to discuss. Once you have the results, just report it to me. When the time comes, the Ministry of Rites can send someone to communicate with the 5-star army." I think it would be better for Minister Hu to go personally. After all, Wu Nanwang is your grandson-in-law. This subject is unwell. Please retire and return to your hometown. The Minister of Rites, Ming, straightforwardly put down the board in his hand and knelt as he spoke. This was clearly a trap. To hand over 1,000,000 commoners for his own safety, this wasn't good to hear but also hard to say. With Ming's shrewdness, it would be strange if he agreed to do such a thing that would go down in history for 10,000 years. Not to mention that Zhu Qiyu had deliberately pointed out his relationship with Yang Qindong. Hu Xiao was even less likely to pick up on this topic. He didn't ask for people to say that he was himself and his grandson-in-law was his grandson-in-law. However, as long as he was the one who did it, it was inevitable that others would mention it and say that he was a traitor. Ming knelt on the ground and asked for his resignation. This greatly exceeded Zhu Qiyu's expectations. The Minister of Rites, Wang Zhi, had already asked for his resignation and he had basically agreed. If he let Ming leave now, those who didn't know would think that he wasn't tolerant. He was venting his anger on his subordinates because they had lost a battle. Zhu Qiyu was someone who cared about his reputation. His face immediately darkened and he wanted to curse. However, he knew that his deterrence towards Ming was too little. He couldn't casually take him down and anger Yang Qindong, but he also couldn't remove him from his position and make Bugnam of Gojoseon think too much. After realizing his helplessness, Zhu Qiyu could only shake his head with an ugly expression. "Since beloved official whose health isn't good, you should rest at home for a while. You are a pillar of the country and cannot be left out. After your body recovers, you still have to share my burdens. I'll leave this matter to the left Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rites, Huang Cheng, to handle." Zhu Qiyu backed down. In the end, he still didn't have the guts to remove Ming from his position. This was enough to prove that he was very afraid of Yang Qindong. "This old subject thanks your majesty." After receiving benefits, Ming expressed his thanks and stood up. Then, he turned and strode away. Although he was old, he didn't seem to be feeling unwell at all. After Ming left, he didn't even have the intention to discuss the matter. It was clear that he wouldn't participate in this matter. This was to avoid suspicion. However, in reality, how could he not want to avoid the matter being discussed? That was millions of commoners. If he handed them over, it would cause a lot of discussion. He definitely wouldn't do something that would damage his reputation. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.